Hey everyone. Welcome back to The Fiction Wizard. Get ready for an amazing tale. What if Harry woke up at Gringotts as Lord of 13 Houses and Goblins arrested Dumbledore for 89 theft curses? Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1, The Ledger of the Dead. The first thing Harry Potter noticed when he opened his eyes was that the ceiling was gold. Not painted gold, not gilded gold, actual gold, veined with copper and something darker that caught the torchlight and threw it back in warm amber pulses, like the building itself was breathing. He stared at it for a long moment, cataloging the sensation of being alive with the detached curiosity of someone who hadn't expected to be. His back was against cold marble. His glasses were somehow still on his face. His wand, he checked immediately, hand snapping to his side before he'd fully decided to move, was in his holster, and the Elder Wand was tucked inside his jacket where he'd shoved it after the forest. Both of them. He had both of them, which meant he hadn't dreamed the last 24 hours, which meant, he sat up. The hall around him was massive and deserted and unmistakably Gringotts. The long counter stretched away to his left, every goblin station empty, the great brass scales still and silent. Torches burned in iron brackets along the walls, but the chandeliers overhead were dark, and the massive front doors were shut. Through the high windows, the sky was the deep bruised purple of very early morning, maybe an hour before sunrise. Harry had absolutely no memory of coming here. He pressed the heel of his hand against his scar, habit, reflex, and also genuine checking, and felt nothing. No burning, no pressure, no whisper of someone else's rage or hunger or fear. Just skin. Just a scar. He'd been half convinced, in the months of hunting Horcruxes, that he'd forgotten what his own head felt like from the inside, unoccupied. It felt strange. It felt good. You are awake. Harry didn't flinch. He turned his head toward the voice and found a goblin standing perhaps 10 feet away, watching him with the particular expression goblins reserved for things they found either fascinating or deeply inconvenient. He was older than most goblins Harry had seen, ancient, really, his face a topographic map of wrinkles and old battles, his eyes the color of hammered bronze. He wore a suit that probably cost more than the Dursleys' house, and he held a leather ledger roughly the size of a gravestone under one arm as though it weighed nothing. Apparently, Harry said. He got to his feet. His knees ached and his shoulders felt like something had been using them for a punching bag, which, to be fair, something had. Is anyone else here? Hermione, Ron, your companions departed several hours ago, with the Aurors who came to collect survivors. The goblin's voice was dry and precise, each word clipped to exactly its necessary length. You were not collected. You were found, later, by one of our night staff, in the lower vaults. Vault 687, to be specific. Harry blinked. That's not my vault. No. Something shifted in the goblin's expression, not quite a smile, but the structural precondition for one. It is not. I am Ragnok, Director of Gringotts. And I have been waiting for you to wake up, Mr. Potter, because we have a great deal to discuss, and I prefer to discuss it with people who are conscious. Harry said automatically. Just Harry is fine. Ragnok regarded him for a moment. Very well. Just Harry. Follow me, please. He didn't wait to see if Harry would comply. He simply turned and walked toward a door set into the far wall behind the counters, the kind of door that blended into the stone so well you'd miss it if you didn't know to look. Harry followed, because what else was he going to do, stand in the middle of Gringotts' lobby alone at 4 in the morning and contemplate the ceiling? The room beyond the door was an office, but calling it an office was like calling Hogwarts a school, technically accurate, catastrophically insufficient. The walls were shelved floor to ceiling with ledgers, every one of them bound in leather of different colors, every spine stamped with a family crest in gold or silver. There was a desk made from something dark and dense that Harry didn't recognize as any wood he'd seen before. On it sat two things, a stack of documents, and a bowl of something liquid that wasn't quite water. It had the faint luminescence of pensive fluid but thicker, less silver, more like pale fire. Ragnok set his massive ledger on the desk, pulled out a chair that was clearly sized for him, and gestured at the chair across from him, which was clearly sized for a wizard. Harry sat. "Before I explain what I'm about to explain," Ragnok said, opening the ledger with the careful hands of a man handling a weapon, "I want to ask you a question. And I want you to answer it honestly, not diplomatically. All right. Did you know that your family's vault had been accessed, outside of your own visits, on 43 separate occasions over the course of your lifetime?" The room felt very quiet suddenly. Harry said, "No." "Did you know that the Black family vault, which passed to you upon the death of Sirius Black, who named you sole heir, had been accessed a further 21 times after Sirius was imprisoned, during which period he obviously could not have authorized any withdrawals?" Harry's jaw tightened. "No." "And did you know," Ragnok continued, his tone never changing, never warming or cooling, staying precisely at that temperature of professional precision, that 11 other vaults, held by families either extinct in the male line, legally dormant, or whose heirs were minor children under magical guardianship, show a combined total of 25 additional unauthorized accesses, each one sealed behind what we call a bureaucratic concealment curse, a specialized piece of magic designed to make Gringotts auditors see nothing unusual in a ledger entry? 25, on top of the 64 we've already discussed. 89 total, Harry. The number landed like a physical thing. 89, Harry repeated. Over the course of 31 years. Ragnok turned the ledger around so Harry could see it. The pages were dense with figures and dates and notations in a script that mixed gobbledygook and English, but the column that mattered was the rightmost one, where each entry was flagged with a small red mark. There were a lot of red marks. "We discovered the first anomaly 3 days ago, when the war's disruption of certain standing charms, specifically, when the wards on Hogwarts fell during the battle, caused a cascade failure in the concealment magic. Like pulling a thread. Once the first one came loose, the whole tapestry unraveled." Harry looked at the pages. He looked at the dates. Some of them were from before he was born. Some of them were from the year he was at Hogwarts for the first time, 11 years old, and had no idea what he owned or what he was worth or what it even meant to have a vault. Some of them were from the year Sirius died. "Who?" Harry said. Ragnok didn't answer immediately. He reached into the desk drawer and produced a single sheet of parchment, smaller than the ledger pages, dense with text in the same precise hand. He placed it on the desk between them. At the top of the sheet, in letters that had been underlined twice and stamped with the Gringotts seal, was a name. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Harry stared at it for a long time. He was aware of his own breathing, steady, which surprised him. He was aware of Ragnok watching him, not with anticipation or cruelty, but with the careful attention of someone who has delivered bad news before and knows that what comes after it matters. "The wand's signature matches," Ragnok said quietly. "It is not ambiguous. It is not circumstantial. We have 89 individual curse signatures, and every single one of them belongs to the same wand. Wand registration is not infallible, Harry, but the Elder Wand has a signature unlike anything in our records. It is identifiable with a certainty that leaves no room for forgery." "He used the Elder Wand," Harry said. "Not a question. For the later thefts, yes. The earlier ones used what we believe was his regular wand. But the Elder Wand's signature is distinctive enough to confirm his involvement beyond any reasonable dispute." Harry sat back. He thought about Dumbledore, dead now, had been dead for 2 years, sitting in his tomb on the Hogwarts grounds with the Elder Wand buried in his hands until Harry had retrieved it. He thought about the Half-Blood Prince's copy of Advanced Potion Making, about the feeling of being steered, about Snape's memories in the Pensieve, about he's got to be killed by Voldemort, the boy's been living on borrowed time. He thought about all of that and found, to his own surprise, that he was not as shocked as he should have been. He was angry, though. Quietly, thoroughly, bone-deep angry, in the way that didn't express itself as heat but as a kind of crystalline clarity. "Right," he said. "What happens now?" Ragnok's expression shifted into something that, on a goblin face, constituted deep satisfaction. "That depends, in part, on you. Gringotts operates under the Goblin banking accords of 1478, which predate the Ministry of Magic by over 2 centuries. Under those accords, theft from a Gringotts-held vault constitutes a crime against Gringotts itself, not merely against the vault's owner. We have the authority to pursue prosecution independent of the ministry." He paused. "We intend to exercise that authority." "You're going to arrest him?" "We are going to arrest him, yes. This morning. At dawn, when our legal team arrives from the Paris branch." Ragnok folded his hands on the desk. "We are informing you as a courtesy, and also because there is a second matter, the one I consider, frankly, more significant, that requires your participation before anything else occurs." He reached under the desk and produced another ledger, this one smaller, bound in something that looked like aged burgundy leather with a crest Harry didn't recognize embossed on the front. He placed it on the desk beside the first. "During the audit," Ragnok said, "we conducted a full inheritance trace on all affected parties. Standard procedure, when we're cataloging stolen assets, we need to establish current legitimate ownership." He opened the smaller ledger to a page near the beginning. "Harry, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not a mistake, and not an exaggeration, and is going to sound extremely improbable." "After the last year," Harry said, "improbable is basically my baseline." "You are the sole living heir," Ragnok said, "to the ancient and noble house of Potter." "That you already knew." "Yes. You are also the sole living heir to the ancient and noble house of Black, through Sirius's bequest and the subsequent failure of all other Black family lines. Sirius told me something like that, once. You are further the heir, through the Black line, to the houses of Rosier, Yaxley, yes, that Yaxley, the line legally forfeited upon his criminal conviction, which transfers to the senior non-convicted bloodline, Flint, Bulstrode, and Lestrange." Ragnok held up one hand as Harry opened his mouth. "By conquest and forfeiture under magical law. Not by any choice of yours. When the male lines of those families were extinguished or convicted, and their magical oaths transferred, the inheritance chains trace directly back to the Black bloodline, and through Black to you." Harry closed his mouth. "Additionally, through your mother's line, which we traced back through the Evans family to the pre-statute Peveril branch, you hold dormant claims to the houses of Peveril, Slytherin, and Gryffindor." The room was so quiet that Harry could hear the torches burning. "Slytherin and Gryffindor," he said, very carefully. "The actual Hogwarts founders." "The actual Hogwarts founders," Ragnok confirmed. "Both lines are so ancient that the claims were considered legally extinct." "They are not extinct. They merely required a carrier who was simultaneously a descendant of both, which is extraordinarily rare and has not occurred since the late 15th century. He paused. "You are a Parselmouth. The Slytherin claim is not a surprise to us." "And Gryffindor?" "Your mother's line is well documented, once you know where to look. The Peverils were a cadet branch of the Gryffindor family. The connection was broken by the statute of secrecy, when several Peveril descendants chose to leave the magical world. Your grandmother's family were among them. Your mother carried the magical potential without the name." Harry thought about his mother, brown eyes, clever hands, the Muggle-born witch who'd apparently been carrying 7 centuries of dormant magical lordship without ever knowing it. Somehow, of all the things he'd been told tonight, that one made him want to smile. It felt like her. Something quiet and powerful and unassuming and absolutely there. "That's," he counted in his head, 11. "The 12th is Hufflepuff," Ragnok said. "Through Helga Hufflepuff's maternal line, which traces through the Welsh wizarding families to the Pruitt bloodline, my grandmother," Harry said immediately. "Molly Weasley's maiden name is Pruitt." My dad's mother was Doria Black, yes. Which creates the connection. The Hufflepuff claim, like the Gryffindor and Slytherin claims, was considered dormant. It is not. That's 12. Harry looked at the ledger page, which was covered in a genealogical tree so dense it looked like a forest. You said 13. The 13th, Ragnok said, and here, for the first time, something in his voice shifted, not dramatic, not theatrical, but careful, like a man setting down something fragile, is the House of Ravenclaw. Harry waited. Helena Ravenclaw died without legitimate issue, Ragnok said. That has always been the accepted history. It is incorrect. She had a daughter, born before her death, given to a Muggle family for protection. The line ran underground for 4 centuries. We traced it 2 nights ago, when the audit magic pulled at every thread simultaneously. He turned the ledger page to show Harry a long genealogical descent, its final line reading, in fresh ink that still looked slightly wet, Evans, Lily Potter, Harry James. The silence this time was different. It was the silence of a puzzle completing itself, every loose piece snapping into place at once, the full picture suddenly visible, and the full picture was both magnificent and terrible. Ravenclaw on my mother's side as well, Harry said. Your mother, Ragnok said simply, was the most magically significant Muggle-born witch in 4 centuries. Not because of accidental latency. Because she was the carrier of multiple dormant bloodlines that the magical world had simply lost track of. He leaned forward slightly. The magical world loses track of a great many things, Harry, when it convinces itself that Muggle-born witches and wizards are unimportant. That landed hard. Harry felt it in his chest, the image of his mother, called a mudblood, dismissed, valued primarily as a sacrifice, carrying in her blood the lines of Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Peverell, Hufflepuff. Walking into a world that sneered at her and not knowing that she was, by the measures that world claimed to care about, more ancient than almost anyone in it. She never knew, Harry said. No. There was no audit that would have found it during her lifetime. And even if there had been, Ragnok's voice was dry, certain people had a significant interest in ensuring that the Potter family's full inheritance was never clearly established. He didn't say Dumbledore's name again. He didn't need to. Harry sat with that for a moment, then set it aside. Later. There was an enormous amount of later to look forward to. So what does this mean, practically speaking, he asked. 13 houses. I understand what it means politically, vaguely, seats in the Wisengamot, that sort of thing. But what does it actually mean, right now, tonight? Ragnok stood. It means, he said, moving toward the shelved walls, that when our legal team arrives in approximately, he checked a device on his wrist that looked nothing like a watch but clearly served the same function, 3 hours, and we proceed with the arrest of Albus Dumbledore on 89 counts of magical theft, fraud, and financial manipulation. The injured parties named in those charges will include not merely the Potter estate, but 12 other houses. And the sole living lord of all 13 of those houses will be standing in this room. He selected a ledger from the shelf, ancient, dark green, its spine cracked with age, and brought it back to the desk. The Goblin banking accords give the injured party significant rights in our prosecution process. You, Harry, are the injured party. All 13 of them. Harry looked at the crest on the dark green ledger's cover. It was the Gryffindor lion, but older than any version he'd seen at Hogwarts, simpler, fiercer, without the decorative scrollwork that the modern version had accumulated. Just the lion, rampant, in plain gold on dark green. The houses each have seals, Ragnok said, sitting back down. Rings, traditionally, though some families opted for other forms. We hold them in the heritage vaults, separate from the financial vaults, not subject to the same access. They cannot be stolen, only claimed, and only by blood. He opened the dark green ledger. Normally, claiming a lordship requires a ritual at the family's ancestral home, witnessed by the Wisengamot. You are not in a normal situation. You are in a Gringotts heritage vault, you have a verified inheritance trace, and I am the director of the oldest financial institution in magical Britain. He looked at Harry steadily. We have an emergency claiming process. It is demanding. But it exists. What does demanding mean? It means it requires willing consent, clear intent, and blood magic. Ragnok's voice was matter-of-fact. The magic will verify each claim as you make it. If any claim is false, the magic will reject it. If any claim is true and you are worthy, the magic will, he paused, searching for a word, settle. It is not entirely pleasant. 13 consecutive claims, one after another, will be significantly less pleasant. How not pleasant? I have seen men pass out after 4. Harry considered this. Then he said, and if I do this now, this morning, before your legal team arrives, then when we arrest Dumbledore at dawn, you walk out that door as the verified, Gringotts certified Lord of 13 ancient houses, with all the legal standing that implies, and the ministry cannot question it, delay it, or quietly make it disappear, because Gringotts certification predates the ministry's authority to certify anything. Ragnok's expression was, Harry thought, as close to approving as a goblin face could comfortably get. The ministry has spent 50 years managing the Potter estate and its related dormant claims under the assumption that a 17-year-old war orphan could be managed. I suspect you are interested in no longer being managed. More than almost anything, Harry said. Ragnok stood again. Then follow me to the heritage vaults. We have 3 hours, and I want you vertical and coherent when the press arrives with the arrest team. Harry followed him out of the office, through a door at its back, and into the network of Gringotts passages that ran behind the public counter area, narrow stone corridors lit by the same amber torches, going deeper and then deeper still, the air growing cooler and carrying that particular underground smell of deep stone and old metal and something else, something that Harry could only describe as time, the smell of things that had been sitting still for a very long while and knew it. They didn't take a cart. The heritage vaults, Ragnok explained as they walked, weren't in the mineshaft section, they were in a different part of the structure entirely, older, carved directly into the bedrock rather than excavated, and accessible only by foot and by blood. The corridor they eventually turned into was visibly ancient, the stone was smoother, worn by centuries of passage, and the torches here were different, their flames a deep blue-white rather than amber, burning without flicker. The door at the end of it was not dramatic. Harry had half expected something like the main Gringotts entrance, all grandeur and brass and deliberate intimidation. What he found instead was a door about 7 feet tall, made of something that looked like black iron but was clearly much older and probably not iron at all, set into the stone with no visible hinges or handle. In the center of it was a handprint in bas-relief. The heritage vault responds to verified bloodline, Ragnok said. Place your right hand on the print. Harry placed his right hand on the print. The metal was cold under his palm and then suddenly warm, and there was a sound like a very large clock unwinding, something deep and mechanical and entirely unlike magic as Harry had ever experienced it, and the door opened inward. The room beyond was not a vault in any traditional sense. It was roughly circular, about 30 feet across, with a domed ceiling that rose to perhaps 20 feet at its center. The walls held shallow alcoves, each one about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, and in each alcove sat a wooden box, dark, simple, no ornamentation except a crest carved into the lid. There were exactly 13 alcoves. In the center of the room was a stone basin, about waist height, dry and empty except for a faint pattern of runes carved into its inner surface. Each box contains the seal of the house, Ragnok said. He remained in the doorway, not, Harry realized, because he couldn't enter, but because it wasn't his place to. You will approach each one in sequence. The claiming order is, eldest line first, converging to most recent. Potter first, as the primary. Then the order I will give you. You open each box, hold the seal, speak the claim. He paused. The words will come. They always do. That's vague. Magic is often vague, Ragnok said. That is why we prefer gold. Harry almost laughed. He walked to the first alcove, the Potter box, which was obvious from the crest on its lid, a stag rampant in a field that had once probably been enamel and was now just carved wood. He lifted the lid. Inside, on a bed of black silk, was a ring, heavy, gold, set with a deep red stone that had an engraving on its face so fine he couldn't read it without squinting. A stag, in miniature, with its antlers curving around the stone's setting. He reached in and picked it up. The moment his fingers closed around it, the room felt different, warmer, pressurized somehow, like the air had thickened very slightly. The runes in the basin lit up, pale gold, and Harry had the sudden clear sense of being watched, not by eyes, but by something much older and more patient. He opened his mouth, not sure what he was going to say, and what came out was, "I am Harry James Potter, son of James Charles Potter, son of Fleamont Henry Potter. The blood is true. The line is direct. I claim the lordship of the ancient and noble house of Potter, freely and without condition, and I will carry it worthy of those who carried it before me." The ring grew warm in his hand, and then it was on his finger, and he had no memory of putting it on, and the warmth spread from his hand up his arm and settled somewhere in the center of his chest, like a coal, steady and permanent. Then it happened again, faster, almost immediately, an invitation that the magic itself seemed to extend, "Come to the next one, the next is waiting," and Harry moved to the second alcove. The black ring was silver, with an onyx stone, and when he picked it up he felt a shiver that had nothing to do with cold, a sensation like recognizing something, like meeting eyes with someone across a crowd. He thought of Sirius, sudden and sharp, and had to breathe through it, and what came out was, "I am Harry James Potter, godson of Sirius Orain Black, heir by bequest and last surviving blood of the direct line. The blood is true. I claim the lordship of the ancient and noble house of Black, in memory of those who should have lived to hold it themselves." The ring settled onto his right hand's middle finger and the warmth doubled. He moved through the others, Rosier, Yaxley, Flint, Bulstrode, Lestrange, each one claimed through the black connection, each one slightly different in sensation, some welcoming, some reluctant, the Lestrange ring actively cold and resistant until he spoke the words and the forfeiture clause activated and it settled with a grudging kind of surrender that felt very on-brand for everything he knew about that family. Then the Peveril ring, which was the strangest, ancient beyond the others, its magic thicker and quieter and somehow more there, and when he spoke the claim he felt something he could only describe as the magic of the Deathly Hallows resonating somewhere in his bones, 3 points in a triangle, the cloak, the stone, the wand, all three recognizing him in a way that made the hair on his arm stand up. Then the founders. Slytherin first, because it was the darker claim and he wanted it behind him. The ring was green and gold, a serpent coiled around a stone of deep emerald, and when he touched it the magic hissed, actually hissed, not the sound but the feeling of a hiss, sharp and immediate, and then recognized him with a sort of enormous disdain, as if it thought he was an entirely unworthy heir but couldn't argue with the bloodline. He accepted it with equal disdain. Gryffindor was warm and immediate, and he had to stop and breathe after it because the feeling it sent through him, lion heat, courage bone deep, red and gold and shining, reminded him so powerfully of being 15 and charging into the Department of Mysteries for people he loved that he had to stand still for a moment and be 17 and exhausted and fine. He was fine, it was over. Ravenclaw was the quietest claim. The ring held an eagle in sapphire and bronze, and when he picked it up he felt something that reminded him, absurdly, of his mother's voice, calm, precise, curious. "Here, think about it like this." He had no memory of her voice, but he thought he might have just found an echo of it, and he said the words very quietly and was grateful there was no one watching. Hufflepuff last among the founders, and Hufflepuff was warm in a completely different way, not the lion heat of Gryffindor but something steadier, deeper, the warmth of good earth and strong roots and people who kept their promises. He claimed it and felt absurdly like it was an old friend's hand on his shoulder. Then the final ring. He stood in front of the last alcove and looked at the box without touching it yet. Ragnok had told him the order but not what the 13th house was, and he'd been tracking Potter, Black, the 6 forfeited families, Peveril, the 4 founders, and there was one left that hadn't been mentioned. He looked at the crest on the box's lid. A phoenix. Not the Dumbledore phoenix, not Fawkes, older than that, or rather, the image that Dumbledore had borrowed, which apparently had a prior claim, a phoenix rising from flame in a field of deep purple, its wings spread wide, its talons open. Below it, a single word in an archaic magical script that Harry recognized from the runes carved into the basin. Emrys. Harry turned and looked at Ragnok, still standing in the doorway with his arms folded and his expression unreadable. Emrys, Harry said. That's Merlin's family name, Ragnok said. Yes. The silence stretched. You're telling me, Harry said slowly, that Merlin left a house. Merlin had a great-niece who married a wizard named Selim Emrys in the year 492. The line continued underground, much like the Ravenclaw line, dipping in and out of the magical record. The last confirmed Emrys line wizard died in 1842 with no known heirs. Ragnok paused. The audit magic found the inheritance trace in the Evans family records. The Evans family had been Emrys for 6 generations before they abandoned the name in the 1700s. He met Harry's eyes. Your mother was Lily Emrys. She just didn't know it. Harry stood there for a moment, holding this information, feeling it settle into him not with shock but with a strange sense of rightness. Like the last piece of a picture he'd been looking at from 2 inches away for his entire life, finally stepping back and seeing the whole shape. He opened the box. The ring inside was simple, compared to the others, plain gold, no stone, just a band with the phoenix crest engraved on its outer face in lines so fine they were almost invisible unless the light hit them directly. He picked it up, and the magic that answered was unlike anything that had come before, not the lion heat or the quiet warmth or the ancestral hiss. It was something like the feeling of casting his Patronus for the first time, when Voldemort had been screaming in his ear and he'd thought of his parents and shouted Expecto Patronum and the stag had exploded out of him with a force that knocked even a Dementor back. That feeling, multiplied by itself until multiplication ceased to be the right word. He said the words. He felt the ring settle, and then felt every other ring settle with it, all 13 simultaneously, a chord struck across 12 rings and resonating in the 13th as its completion, and the light in the room bloomed from pale gold to something much brighter and Harry stood in the center of it with his hands open, 12 rings on 12 fingers with the 13th settling invisible on his right thumb, and felt the magic of 13 houses move through him like a river through country that had been waiting a long time for water. He did not pass out. He came close. The world grayed at the edges and he locked his knees and breathed and held onto the basin's rim until the gray retreated and the room sharpened again. When it was over, 2 minutes, maybe 3, he straightened up, flexed his hands, looked at the rings, and felt the weight of them. Not heavy, exactly. Present. Like the rings weren't sitting on him but with him, which was different. He walked back to the door. Ragnok was watching him with that same careful, assessing expression. You didn't pass out, Ragnok said. I thought about it, Harry admitted. 13 is a lot. Most men would not have made it past Lestrange. The forfeiture magic is designed to be hostile to non-direct heirs. He considered Harry for a moment with what might have been something approaching respect. You are considerably more stubborn than you appear. I've been told that before, Harry said. By people who found it inconvenient. Ragnok almost smiled. He turned and led Harry back up through the blue torch corridors toward the main building, and as they walked, the quality of light coming through the high windows had shifted, the purple had gone and in its place was the deep gray-pink of early dawn, the first suggestion of a sun that hadn't risen yet but was thinking seriously about it. Your friends, Ragnok said as they emerged back into the office. You will want to contact them. In a minute, Harry said. He'd caught sight of something through the office's narrow window, movement outside, on the cobbled street that fronted the Gringotts entrance. He moved to the window and looked out. The press was already there. It was barely past dawn and there were 6 reporters crowded on the street, which given that the war had ended roughly 16 hours ago wasn't entirely surprising. The Prophet and its rivals were probably running a 24-hour operation. Rita Skeeter was visible at the front of the group, her quick quotes quill spinning in the early morning air. And coming down the street from the direction of the leaky cauldron, moving at a pace that was deliberate and formal and left no room for misinterpretation, was a group of 9 goblins in formal Gringotts security armor. Their armor was not ceremonial, it was functional, dark metal etched with binding runes, each goblin carrying a short weapon that combined characteristics of a sword and something Harry had no name for, something that crackled faintly with contained magical energy. Beside them walked a wizard Harry recognized, Gringotts' primary legal representative for the British branch, a witch named Agath Longsword who'd been mentioned in passing by Bill Weasley once, and whose reputation apparently made Ministry legal teams nervous. "They've come from the apparition point," Ragnok said from just behind Harry's shoulder. "The team from Paris. We sent word 2 hours ago." "Where are they going first?" "Hogwarts," Ragnok said. "Dumbledore has been there since the battle ended. He stayed. I imagine he thought the Ministry would manage any investigation and he would be consulted as a beloved elder statesman." A pause. He was not entirely wrong about the Ministry. He was wrong about Gringotts. Harry watched the arrest party march down Diagon Alley, crisp and purposeful in the early morning, their armor catching what little light the dawn was offering and throwing it back sharp and cold. Rita Skeeter had spotted them and was already scribbling something, her mouth open. The other reporters were turning to look. "I want to be there," Harry said. "I expected as much," Ragnok said. "There is a Gringotts side-along available to authorized parties. You are now, as of approximately 40 minutes ago, a Gringotts certified holder of 13 noble house claims, which makes you an authorized party for any proceeding related to those houses." He paused. "It would, I imagine, also be useful to have you present when the wizarding press asks what is happening." Harry looked down at his hands. 12 rings, visible. The Emery's ring, invisible except for its warmth. He flexed his fingers and felt the magic settle into a new equilibrium, not uncomfortable, just there, part of him the way his wand was part of him, the way the scar had been part of him except that this was something he'd chosen and those others hadn't been his to choose. "One thing first," he said, and pulled out the small communication mirror he'd kept in his jacket pocket since Sirius had given him its twin, long ago. He'd replaced the mirror twice during the year of hunting, and the current version was a slightly battered rectangular glass that Hermione had linked to a network of mirrors they'd set up for the Horcrux hunt. He tapped it and said, "Hermione." The mirror fogged and then cleared. Hermione's face appeared, her hair worse than he'd ever seen it, which given the last several months was genuinely impressive. She was sitting at what looked like a kitchen table, the burrow, maybe, or somewhere like it, with a mug in her hand and eyes that had the particular bright, hollow look of someone who hadn't slept. "Harry, oh thank God," she started. "I'm fine. I'm at Gringotts. I need you to do something for me and I need you to not ask questions yet because I'll explain everything in about an hour when this is over, but I need you to listen carefully." He paused. "Get Ron. Get Neville if you can reach him. And get somewhere with a good view of the main Hogwarts gates, because in about 20 minutes something is going to happen that you're going to want to see." Hermione stared at him. The look on her face cycled through about 6 emotions in 2 seconds. "Harry, what, I'm fine," he said again, and this time he meant it in a way he hadn't meant it in a very long time, maybe ever. "I promise. I'll tell you everything. But trust me right now, yeah?" A beat. Then Hermione, who had trusted him in a tent in the middle of nowhere with dwindling food and a Horcrux making everyone miserable, said, "All right. 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Maybe less." He pocketed the mirror and looked at Ragnok. "Ready," he said. The side-along apparition from inside Gringotts was nothing like the regular kind, it was smooth and cold and entirely without the uncomfortable squeezing sensation, more like being moved through space by something that had absolute confidence in its ability to move things through space and didn't need to make a fuss about it. When Harry's vision cleared, he was standing on the path that wound up from Hogsmeade toward Hogwarts, the castle still showing its battle damage ahead, scorched stones, a crenellation missing from the astronomy tower, the lawn with its craters and scorch marks and the evidence of everything that had happened here less than a full day ago. The Goblin arrest team was 30 feet ahead of him, moving with the same measured purpose. The reporters, 6 of them now swelled to nearly a dozen as the word had gotten out somehow, clustered behind a hasty line they'd formed around the Hogsmeade end of the path, not following but watching with the hungry attention of people who knew they were about to witness something significant. Harry stood slightly to the side and waited. The great doors of Hogwarts opened before the goblins reached them. From inside, he caught the flash of robes, several people, ministry officials by the look of them, and behind them, moving slowly, leaning slightly on his wand as a walking stick, white beard luminous in the pale morning light, Albus Dumbledore. He'd been told, then. Someone had warned him. It didn't matter, the expression on his face, the way he walked forward with his chin up, suggested that he'd decided to meet it with dignity. Perhaps he'd hoped to speak first, to explain, to contextualize it in the way that he contextualized everything. He was very good at giving true things a shape that made them seem different from what they were. The Goblin legal team stopped 10 feet from the door. Agatha Longsword stepped forward. She was a head taller than any of the goblins with her, with close-cropped gray hair and the expression of someone who had won every argument she'd ever been in and fully expected to continue the trend. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, she said, and her voice was the kind that didn't need to be loud, that hit you like something physical simply by virtue of its absolute certainty. You are hereby charged, under the Goblin Banking Accords of 1478 and their 17 subsequent amendments, with 89 counts of magical theft from Gringotts-held vaults, 42 counts of financial fraud, and 6 counts of illegal manipulation of inheritance documentation. These charges are filed on behalf of Gringotts Bank and on behalf of the 13 ancient and noble houses whose estates were subject to said theft. The reporters were not breathing. Somewhere behind Harry, a quick quotes quill fell and nobody picked it up. Dumbledore looked at Longsword with his pale blue eyes, and said, "I see." He didn't deny it. Harry noticed that. Later, he would think about that, the absence of surprise, the absence of outrage, the complete and immediate composure of a man who had known this moment was coming, who had perhaps been waiting for it for some time and was oddly, deeply relieved. "The 13 houses," Dumbledore said, his eyes moving past Longsword, past the goblins, finding Harry's face in the crowd with the uncanny accuracy he'd always had. "I suppose that means you've had a very productive night, Harry." Harry looked back at him, across the 30 feet of scarred Hogwarts path, in the pale early morning of the day after the war. He was wearing 13 rings and carrying 2 wands, and he wasn't a symbol or a savior or a weapon or a boy anymore. He was a person who'd had a very long night and had a great many things to sort out and was looking, right now, at the man who had stolen from him every year of his life, and who had also kept him alive, and who had also spent years managing his death like a budgeted expense. "Good morning, sir," Harry said. There was a beat. Dumbledore almost smiled, something tender and terribly sad in the curve of it. "Good morning, Harry." Then the Goblin guards moved forward, and Dumbledore did not resist, and the reporters erupted, and somewhere up the path toward the castle Harry heard a familiar voice shout, "Harry," and turned to see Hermione sprinting down the hill with Ron at her heels, both of them looking like they hadn't slept and also like they'd just witnessed something that had rearranged their understanding of several things at once. The morning was fully arrived now, the sun pushing over the horizon to find a world that was the same world it had been yesterday and also completely different. Harry waited for his friends, and felt the weight of 13 rings on his hands, and watched Albus Dumbledore walk away between goblin guards in the most important morning of his life. He'd get a proper sleep eventually. There was a great deal to do first. Chapter 2, The weight of 13 rings. Hermione hit him like a freight train. She wrapped both arms around him before he'd fully turned to meet her, and the force of it rocked him back a step, and he hugged her back just as hard because she was warm and real and alive, and those three things had been uncertain enough recently that he didn't take any of them for granted. She was shaking slightly, or he was, or both of them, and neither of them said anything for a moment, just stood there on the path while the morning light spread across the scarred Hogwarts grounds and the reporters behind them generated a noise like a disturbed beehive. Ron arrived 3 seconds later and made it a three-person collision that nearly took all of them off their feet, and Harry laughed, the sound surprising him, coming out rough and slightly broken but genuine, and for a long moment the three of them were just themselves, just Harry and Ron and Hermione. Alive on a Tuesday morning in May with no Horcruxes left to find and no Voldemort left to fear and an absolutely enormous amount of chaos just getting started. Then Hermione pulled back and looked at his hands. The rings caught the morning light, 12 of them visible, gold and silver and bronze, each one distinct, the Stag of Potter, the Serpent of Slytherin, the Eagle of Ravenclaw, the Badger of Hufflepuff, the Lion of Gryffindor in its archaic form, the others varying from ornate to plain. On two hands that belonged to a 17-year-old who'd been sleeping on dungeon floors for the past several months, they looked slightly surreal. Hermione's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Harry, those are house rings, those are, she counted, her eyes moving rapidly over his fingers. That's more than, Harry, how many? 13, Harry said. The silence from Ron was more eloquent than most speeches. 13, Hermione repeated. Technically 12 visible, Harry said, holding up his right thumb where the Emery's ring sat, invisible except to him and, apparently, to Gringotts magic. The 13th one's a bit shy. Ron found his voice. It came out slightly strangled. Mate. That's, what, how, he stopped, ran a hand through his already catastrophic hair, and tried again. Okay. From the beginning. Why were you at Gringotts? Don't know, actually. I woke up there. You woke up at Gringotts. In a heritage vault, apparently. Ragnok, he's the director, thinks the magic pulled me there during the night. Something about the inheritance trace activating when the Hogwarts wards fell. Harry shrugged. I've been pulled somewhere by magic I didn't understand before. Usually means something important. He was aware of movement in his peripheral vision, reporters jostling for position, several of them clearly trying to get close enough to hear. He clocked them, noted their positions, and filed it away for later. The arrest, Hermione said quietly, dropping her voice. Her expression had gone from shock to the particular focused intensity she got when she was processing something large and fast. 89 counts. I heard Longsword read the charges. She paused. Harry, I need you to tell me everything, because I'm looking at a situation that has legal implications they're enormous, and I can't strategize without the full picture. Come to Gringotts, Harry said. Ragnok wants to meet you both. I may have mentioned your names. Ron blinked. You told the Gringotts director about us? I told him you were the two people whose advice I trust most. Harry turned toward the path back to Hogsmeade. He seemed to find it more reassuring than I expected. They fell into step beside him, Hermione already generating questions at a pace that suggested she'd been storing them up for the 2 minutes since she'd seen the rings. Harry answered as they walked, keeping his voice low, giving her the condensed version, the audit, the wand signature, the inheritance trace, the claiming ritual in the heritage vault. He watched her face as he talked, watching the pieces land, watching her slot them into the framework she was already building. Ron was quieter. Harry noticed, but didn't push. The reporters tried to intercept them before they reached Hogsmeade proper. 3 of them fell into step alongside Harry with the aggressive friendliness of people who'd made a career out of friendly aggression. Lord Potter. That was Terry Hawkins from the Evening Prophet, who Harry vaguely recognized. Can you confirm the charges against Dumbledore? Can you tell us about the inheritance claims? Is it true you're now Lord of 13 Houses? Sources are saying, I'll be making a statement at 10 this morning, Harry said, without breaking stride. At Gringotts. Invite whoever you want. He glanced sideways at Hawkins, who was scribbling furiously. And it's Harry. Just Harry. Hawkins looked up. Not Lord Potter? If you call me Lord Potter, I'll stop answering your questions, Harry said pleasantly. Doesn't mean the title isn't real. It means I find it embarrassing and I'll be difficult about it. Hawkins blinked, then laughed, surprised. Right. Just Harry it is. They moved on. Hermione waited until they were clear of the reporters, then said, quietly and precisely, you know that a statement at 10 this morning, less than 12 hours after the end of a war, about the arrest of Albus Dumbledore, with you standing there in 13 house rings, is going to be the most widely read thing in the Prophet's history. Yes, Harry said. And you're going to be completely ready for it. It wasn't quite a question. Harry answered it anyway. Yes. She looked at him for a moment, studying, assessing, looking for the exhausted 17-year-old who'd been running on dwindling hope for the last 8 months and finding something else there alongside him. Something steadier. She made a small sound that wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite relief but contained elements of both. Tell me what you want to achieve, she said, and I'll help you do it. I know you will, Harry said. That's why you're here. Ron was still quiet. The side-along apparition back into Gringotts accommodated all three of them. Ragnok had apparently approved their presence, because the goblin who met them at the entrance barely glanced at Ron and Hermione before waving them through with Harry. They were taken back to Ragnok's office, where the morning's documents had been joined by more, arranged in ordered stacks that suggested preparation rather than chaos. A breakfast of sorts had appeared on one end of the desk, not wizard food, goblin food, which turned out to mean dense dark bread, preserved meats, dried fruit, and tea that was darker and stronger than anything Harry had drunk before and exactly what he needed. Ragnok was already there, along with Agath Longsword, who had returned from the Hogwarts operation with the brisk energy of someone who'd completed a satisfying task and was ready for the next one. She looked at Harry's friends with a lawyer's immediate assessment. The Granger girl, she said, not unkindly. Your legal work during the Horcrux campaign was noted. The documents you extracted from the Department of Mysteries have already been provided to our legal team. Hermione sat down very straight. What documents? The ones you photographed during the break-in. You didn't know they'd be useful to us. They are. A rare, thin smile. You have a gift for thorough evidence gathering. Ron looked at Hermione. You took photographs of Ministry documents during a break-in. It was relevant at the time, Hermione said, with the particular dignity of someone who is absolutely not apologizing for anything. Ragnok looked at Harry. We have approximately 2 hours before your press statement. I want to discuss how Gringotts will characterize our role in what follows, because our interest in this case extends beyond the recovery of stolen funds. Harry poured himself tea and sat. You want institutional reform. Ragnok blinked. Longsword paused mid-reach for a document. The Ministry has been overriding Goblin banking accord protections for 30 years, Harry continued. He'd been turning this over since their earlier conversation, building the shape of it as they'd walked. Fudge's administration, specifically. You've been tolerating it because open conflict with the Ministry is worse for business than quiet erosion of your rights. But you've been waiting for a moment when the leverage shifted. He looked at Ragnok. 89 theft charges against the most respected wizard in Britain is a significant leverage shift. Ragnok was quiet for a moment. You have been awake for approximately 1 morning, he said. I've been thinking about power structures for most of a year, Harry said. Voldemort had them. Dumbledore had them. The Ministry had them. I spent a long time figuring out how they worked because I needed to find the places where they didn't. He set down his cup. I'm not going to use you, Ragnok. I'm not going to be grateful for your help and then forget that gratitude when it's convenient. That's not how I do things. He met the goblin's bronze eyes steadily. I think we want some of the same things. I think we should say that plainly and build on it. The silence in the room had a particular quality. Longsword glanced at Ragnok. Ragnok looked at Harry, and what was in his face now was something Harry hadn't seen a goblin express before, something more personal than professional respect. My grandfather, Ragnok said, dealt with your great-grandfather Fleamont Potter. He described him as the only wizard he'd ever worked with who treated a contract as a promise rather than a weapon. He paused. I wondered if the line had produced anyone similar. I'm inclined to think it has. Right, Harry said. So let's talk. They talked for an hour and a half. Hermione took notes with a self-writing quill that she produced from somewhere and positioned at the corner of the desk with the automatic efficiency of someone who had never once in her life let an important conversation go undocumented. Ron mostly listened, which was unusual enough that Harry kept half his attention on his friend even while discussing ministry oversight of Goblin financial rights with Ragnok and arguing specific clauses of the banking accords with Longsword, who was sharp as a blade and twice as precise. By 9:30, they had the bones of something. Gringotts would pursue the criminal prosecution of Dumbledore independently, but Harry, as the injured party in all 13 house claims, would provide a public endorsement of the Goblin process and speak explicitly about the banking accord's preeminence over ministry financial law. In return, Gringotts would acknowledge and support the political standing of the 13 houses as Harry began to exercise it, providing documentation and historical evidence that the ministry couldn't easily challenge. It was, as Longsword noted with professional admiration, a clean exchange. When the reporters arrived, and they arrived in force, 16 of them crammed into the Gringotts lobby with the front doors held open by 2 goblin guards who looked as though they found the entire enterprise deeply undignified. Harry stood at the top of the front steps with Hermione to his left and Ragnok to his right and felt, for the first time, completely certain about what he was going to say. He looked out at the crowd. The reporters. The few dozen witches and wizards who'd gathered in Diagon Alley as news spread, because news in the wizarding world spread about as fast as a flu call with fewer steps in between. Rita Skeeter in the front with her quill already spinning. Terry Hawkins from last night. A photographer from Witch Weekly who seemed to be mostly interested in the rings. Harry spoke. Yesterday, he said, a war ended. A lot of people died, and a lot of people didn't, and both groups need time and space and support, and I'm not going to stand here and turn their deaths into a political statement. He paused. What I'm going to do instead is tell you something that happened this morning, which is separate from the war and also not separate from it, because almost nothing in this world is. The quills were moving. He didn't look at them. Gringotts Bank conducted an audit that was triggered when the Hogwarts wards fell during the battle last night. That audit found evidence of 89 unauthorized accesses to Gringotts-held vaults, each one concealed using specialized curse work, all traceable to a single wand signature. He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. Albus Dumbledore was arrested this morning at dawn by Gringotts legal authorities under the banking accords of 1478. He is currently in Gringotts custody. He will be charged with 89 counts of magical theft, 42 counts of financial fraud, and 6 counts of inheritance document manipulation. The lobby noise was extraordinary. He waited for it to quiet. The affected vaults include the Potter Estate, the Black Estate, and 11 other houses, 7 of them dormant, 4 of them whose heirs were minors under wizarding guardianship at the time of the thefts. He kept his voice level. I want to be clear about something, because there's going to be a strong impulse in the next few days to contextualize this, to say that Dumbledore was fighting a war and the ends justified the means, or that the money went to good causes, or that we shouldn't tarnish a legacy. He looked directly at Rita Skeeter when he said the next part, because Rita Skeeter had been tarnishing legacies for 30 years and this was the one time it was both true and necessary. He stole from children. From orphans. From families that had no one left to advocate for them. That is what the evidence shows, and the evidence is not ambiguous. More noise. He waited again. I also want to say this, because I think it matters. I am not interested in a world where Albus Dumbledore is the villain and everything else gets a pass. The Ministry failed. The Wizengamot failed. A system that allowed one man to accumulate enough unchecked authority that he could steal from 13 houses over 30 years without anyone noticing, that system failed. Dumbledore's arrest is the beginning of a process, not the end of one. He paused. That process is going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people and a lot of institutions. I'd rather it be uncomfortable than dishonest. He let the silence run for a moment, then said, I'll take 3 questions. Every hand in the lobby went up. He pointed at Terry Hawkins because he'd said he would. Hawkins, to his credit, had composed himself. Lord, Harry. The 13 houses. Can you confirm the full list? Potter, Black, Rosier, Yaxley, Flint, Bulstrode, Lestrange, Peveril, Slytherin, Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, and Emrys. He said it flatly, without performance. The room went very quiet at the founders' names and stayed quiet at Emrys. Gringotts certified all 13 this morning. The documentation is available through their public records office. He pointed at a reporter he didn't recognize, a young woman from the Quibbler who looked slightly overwhelmed by the general atmosphere. What are your intentions, politically? With 13 seats in the Wizengamot, you could reconstruct the political landscape from scratch, Harry said. Yes. I'm aware. I'm planning to use my seats to support good legislation and block bad legislation, which I appreciate sounds obvious and isn't. He glanced sideways at Hermione for just a fraction of a second. I'm also planning to appoint proxies for most of the houses, because I'm 17 and I have other things to do with my life than sit in the Wizengamot all day, and I want people who are genuinely expert in those seats rather than just famous. He paused. 3rd question. He did not point at Rita Skeeter. He pointed at a wizard near the back he'd noticed because the man had been the quietest person in the room, not scribbling, not jostling, just watching. The man straightened, surprised to be chosen. Will you press for the maximum penalty against Dumbledore? He asked. His voice was low and careful. Harry thought about Dumbledore's face on the Hogwarts path. The sad almost smile. Good morning, Harry. I want a fair trial, Harry said. I want every piece of evidence examined and every argument heard. I want the prosecution to be thorough and the defense to be heard, because I don't want this to be a spectacle, I want it to be justice. He paused. And then I want the verdict to be whatever the evidence supports. Whatever that is. However uncomfortable it is for anyone. Another pause, shorter. That includes me. I'm not above an uncomfortable verdict. He stepped back from where he'd been standing. Ragnok moved forward slightly, taking the space that Harry vacated in a way that communicated clearly to anyone watching that the Gringotts director was not a supporting actor in this story. Gringotts Bank, Ragnok said, in the tone of a man who has never in his life raised his voice because he has never needed to, will be releasing a full public statement regarding the audit findings and the charges filed, available at our public records counter within the hour. All documentation has been prepared in accordance with the banking accords and is open for independent legal review. He looked out over the crowd with the particular expression of a goblin who has been underestimated by wizards for centuries and finds it neither surprising nor particularly interesting anymore. Gringotts does not make mistakes in its accounting. We did not make a mistake here. I suggest the wizarding world proceed accordingly. He stepped back. The statement was over. The lobby erupted again, reporters shouting questions, quills spinning, a photographer's flash going off repeatedly, and Harry turned and walked back into the building with Hermione and Ron on his heels, leaving the noise behind them as the great doors swung closed. In the relative quiet of the corridor behind the main hall, Hermione exhaled. Right, she said. That was very good. Thank you. The part about the system, not just Dumbledore, that was important. You framed it correctly. I meant it. I know. That's why it was good. She paused. We need to get you proper clothes before anything else happens. Harry looked down at himself. He was still wearing yesterday's battle clothes, dark jeans, a torn jacket, a shirt that had been several colors at several points in the past 24 hours. He was wearing the 12 visible rings and carrying 2 wands. He probably looked like a slightly tattered prop from a dramatic theatrical production. My vault, he said. I'll need to visit it properly at some point today anyway. Your vaults, Hermione corrected. Plural. 13 of them. She said it gently but precisely, the way she said everything that was simultaneously true and overwhelming. Harry flexed his hands, 13 rings, or 12 and 1 invisible, and felt the weight and warmth of them, and thought, right. 13 vaults. 13 seats. 13 houses, each with its own history and estates and magic and complications, all of it his, suddenly, this morning, whether he'd asked for it or not. He thought about the claiming ritual in the Heritage Vault, the lion heat of Gryffindor, the quiet echo of his mother in Ravenclaw, the deep roots of Hufflepuff, the proud resistant surrender of Slytherin. 13 different magics settling into him like rivers into a sea. He'd chosen each one. He'd said the words with full intent. He hadn't asked for it, but he'd chosen it. That distinction mattered. Ron said, I need to talk to you. His voice was quiet and tight and Harry heard the specific frequency in it, not the tightness of fear or anger, but the tightness of someone carrying a weight they've been carrying for a while and have decided, finally, to put down. Hermione heard it too. She said, I'll speak to Longsword about the vault access documentation, and disappeared with the tactful efficiency of someone who is excellent at giving people space while also absolutely positioning herself within earshot in case anything important needed to be documented. Harry looked at Ron. They'd been best friends for 6 years. Harry knew Ron's silences the way he knew Quidditch weather, knew the difference between contemplative quiet and processing quiet, and there's something I'm not saying quiet, and this was definitively the third kind, had been since Harry had walked back up the Hogwarts path this morning and the sequence of events had become clear. Sit down, Harry said, because they were still standing in a corridor and there was a bench along one wall, put there for waiting clients, probably, and it was empty. They sat. Ron looked at his hands for a moment, then said, the Order of the Phoenix received funding. You know that. Mum knows that. Everyone knows that. Dumbledore managed the Order's finances, he always had. But Mum and Dad never asked where the money actually came from because... He stopped. Because Dumbledore, Harry said. Because Dumbledore, Ron agreed, and the bitterness in it was slight but real. They trusted him completely. Everyone trusted him completely. And I'm sitting here trying to work out if the reason we had food on the table some months when things were really tight was because, he stopped again. His jaw tightened. Because it was your money. Your family's money. Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about it honestly, thought about the Weasleys' kitchen, warm and crowded and always somehow managing to produce enough food, thought about the Order meetings he'd been excluded from, thought about the money that flowed through Dumbledore's hands like water, going where he decided it should go for reasons he'd decided were sufficient. I don't know yet, Harry said. I don't have the full audit report, that'll take weeks to properly trace where everything went. He looked at Ron. But I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it properly. Ron looked up. Whatever the money trace shows about the Order funds, Harry said, I don't hold you accountable. Or your parents. Or any of your family. He said it plainly, without softening it into something sentimental, because Ron didn't need sentiment right now, he needed clarity. You didn't steal from me. Dumbledore made decisions that affected your family without your knowledge or consent, same as he made decisions that affected mine. If the trace shows that Order funding came from my vaults, then Dumbledore owes me a debt, not your family. Ron swallowed. Harry, I mean it. I'm not being generous, I'm being accurate. There's a difference. Harry looked at him steadily. You are the first friend I ever had in my life. Your mum made me Christmas jumpers. Your dad thought plugs were exotic. Your family, he stopped, and something moved in his face that he didn't entirely manage to control. Your family was the first place I ever felt like a person instead of a problem. That doesn't have a price. And it doesn't become less true because of what someone else did with money. Ron was quiet for a long moment. He was doing the thing where he pretended to be looking at the floor when actually he was just waiting for his face to stop doing something he didn't want it to do. Then he said, "Right." "Right," Harry agreed. Ron straightened. Flexed his shoulders. Looked at the rings on Harry's hands with a more focused attention, like he was seeing them for the first time rather than the third. So. 13 houses. 13 houses. Including Slytherin. Including Slytherin. And Merlin. And Merlin, yes. Ron stared at him for a long moment. You realize, he said, with the slow dawning tone of someone working through the full implications, that this means you're technically the most powerful magical lord in Britain. Possibly in Europe. Possibly, Harry agreed. And you stood there and told the press your title was embarrassing. It is embarrassing. Harry. Ron's voice had changed, the tightness gone, replaced by something closer to his normal frequency, which involved a mixture of affection, exasperation, and occasional awe. You are the Lord of Merlin's house. You can't just tell people it's embarrassing. Watch me, Harry said. Ron let out a breath that was either a laugh or a sigh or both, and stood up, and that was that, the weight he'd been carrying set down neatly, the ground between them clear. It wasn't as simple as a conversation, Harry knew, and the questions about the Weasley family finances would probably come up again when the audit report arrived, but the ground between him and Ron was clear, and that was the thing that mattered. They found Hermione in the records office with longsword, surrounded by parchment, in her natural habitat. The next hours were dense and procedural, and Harry found, to his own surprise, that he didn't mind. There was something satisfying about sitting with Longsword and Hermione and working through the actual documentation, the vault inventories, the inheritance certificates, the list of properties associated with the various houses. Some of the properties were in ruins. Some had been seized by the ministry at various points. Some appeared to be in active use by families who'd been living in them for decades without any legal claim to them, which was going to be a conversation Harry wasn't looking forward to but wouldn't avoid. He ate properly for the first time in what felt like weeks. Dark goblin bread and strong tea, and then later a sandwich that Hermione produced from somewhere with the mysterious efficiency she demonstrated around food whenever they'd been running too hard to eat properly. He let himself feel tired, briefly, and then set it aside, because there was still too much to do. Around midday, Neville arrived. He came through the front door with the slightly windswept look of someone who had apparated directly, which meant he'd either just gotten his apparition license or was currently a bit reckless about it. Given that Neville had spent the last year doing things that would have made his pre-war self faint, Harry suspected the latter. He was taller than Harry remembered, they'd been in the same dungeon corridors and battle lines often enough that the individual changes had been invisible, but now, standing in the Gringotts lobby in daylight, Neville Longbottom looked like someone who had decided, at some point in the past 8 months, to become someone else entirely. He still had the same round face, but the uncertainty that had lived in it for most of his life was simply gone, replaced by something quiet and grounded and not to be trifled with. "Heard you arrested Dumbledore," he said, by way of greeting. "Gringotts arrested him," Harry said. "I just watched. Luna says the press statement this morning was the best piece of political communication she's seen since Dumbledore's own speech after Voldemort's first defeat, and she thinks that's funny." Neville looked at Harry's hands. He went still for a moment, reading the rings with the attention of someone who knew his heraldry. "Harry. That's the Longbottom rose." Harry looked at his hands. "Which one?" "Left middle finger." That ring, the gold one with the white stone, that's a moonstone, that's the Longbottom family seal. Harry looked at it. Then looked at Ragnok, who had appeared from somewhere with his usual immaculate timing. The Longbottom claim, Ragnok said, is not one of the 13. The Longbottom vault was not among those subject to unauthorized access. He paused. However, the audit did flag a related matter, which we were planning to raise this afternoon. Neville looked at him with a very steady expression. What matter? Ragnok produced a slim folder from under his arm. The Longbottom estate was placed under ministry-administered guardianship following the incapacitation of Frank and Alice Longbottom. Your grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, serves as guardian of the person, but the financial administration was given to a ministry-appointed trustee in 1981. He opened the folder. That trustee has been drawing a 5% administrative fee from your estate annually for 24 years. Neville did the math. Harry could see it happen, the slight shift in his face, the particular expression of someone adding up a number they already suspected and finding it worse than expected. That's legal, Neville said carefully. The fee itself, yes. The investment decisions made with the Longbottom estate funds are less clearly legal. Ragnok turned a page. Your trustee has, over the past 24 years, invested Longbottom estate funds in 17 ventures. 14 of those ventures also received investment from the trustee's personal accounts. In 11 of the 14 cases, the trustee's personal investment was made before the Longbottom estate investment, meaning the trustee's own financial position benefited from the use of your funds. He closed the folder. That is called self-dealing. It is not legal. The quiet in the room was the specific quiet of someone containing something significant. Who's the trustee? Harry asked. Broderick Bode, Ragnok said. Former unspeakable, current, he's dead, Harry said flatly. Killed in hospital, first year of the war. The Death Eaters got to him. He'd heard the story through order channels. Bode had been used by Voldemort, Imperiust, something had gone wrong, he'd ended up in St. Mungo's and someone had sent him a plant. His estate, Ragnok said, is administered by the ministry. Which means the Longbottom claim for recovery of self-dealt funds would be filed against the Ministry Estate Office. He paused. Which happens to be the same office that administered your guardianship during your time with the Dursley family. Hermione made a small sharp sound. Convenient, Harry said, in a tone that meant the opposite. Neville had been very still during all of this. He looked at the folder in Ragnok's hands, then at Harry, and what Harry saw in his face was not grief or shock but something that had been waiting for a long time to become action. I want to file, Neville said. Whatever the process is. I want to file today. We prepared the documents this morning, Longsword said from the doorway, which explained her absence for the past hour. Given the general audit that's been running, we anticipated this might be relevant. Neville looked at her. Gringotts prepared documents for a Longbottom claim this morning, before I even arrived. We are very thorough, Longsword said. Neville took the folder from Ragnok with both hands, looked at the top sheet, and said, What do I need to sign? Harry watched him sign the documents, 3 sheets, each one witnessed by Longsword and stamped with the Gringotts seal, and thought about how Neville Longbottom at 11 had been afraid of almost everything and was now standing in Gringotts signing papers against the ministry's estate office with the calm certainty of someone who had decided, a long time ago, that he was done being afraid. He thought about Trevor the Toad, and the Remembrall, and the look on Neville's face in first year when he'd been knocked off his broom by Marcus Flint and Harry had dived after his Remembrall and found something in the dive that he hadn't known he was looking for. He thought about Neville at the Battle of Hogwarts, pulling the sword of Gryffindor out of the sorting hat while Harry was supposedly dead. He thought he might owe Neville Longbottom a larger debt than he'd properly acknowledged. Neville, he said, when the paperwork was done. Neville looked up. I'm going to need proxies, Harry said. People I trust to hold the Wisengamot seats for houses that need proper representation rather than just a famous name behind them. He held Neville's gaze. You know more about wizarding legal and social history than almost anyone our age. You've got the Longbottom name behind you now that you're 17 and taking your own seat. And you're not afraid of anything. He paused. I'd want you to hold at least 2 of the seats, Hufflepuff and Gryffindor, specifically. Because both of those houses represent things I think you actually stand for, rather than just names. Neville was quiet for a moment. Hufflepuff, he said slowly, because I'm loyal and I keep more actions request aborted right the next chapter now. Chapter 3, Fire and Old Oaths. The Longbottom ancestral estate was called Whitmore Hall, and it was in Yorkshire, and it was a ruin. Not dramatically so, not the Gothic skeleton of a place, not crumbled towers and wildfire ivy, but the quiet, steady ruin of a house that had simply been left alone for too long. The gateposts still stood. The drive was still gravel, mostly, except where grass had come through the gaps in long pale blades. The hall itself had all its walls and most of its roof, and the windows were intact, which spoke to protective magic that had outlasted the attention of anyone who cared about the place behind them. Harry stood at the gate with Neville and felt the weight of it. Gran comes twice a year, Neville said. She maintains the wards. Says she's keeping it ready. He paused. I used to think that was optimism. Now I think it was stubbornness. Might be both, Harry said. Neville pushed the gate open. It moved without complaint, as though it had been waiting for exactly this. They walked up the drive together, the morning's late sun doing its best on the pale stone facade, and Harry kept his hands at his sides and felt, because he couldn't not feel it, the rings made that impossible, the responding pulse of this place's magic against the Hufflepuff ring on his left hand. A recognition, deep and subterranean. Yes. This connects. Behind them, at a distance that said clearly I am here and also clearly giving you space, Hermione was documenting everything on a dictation quill while simultaneously reviewing the properties list that Longsword had provided. Ron was looking at the hall with the expression of someone mentally cataloging what needed repairing, which was a very Ron way of engaging with something overwhelming. It was the afternoon of the day after the Battle of Hogwarts, which meant it was the afternoon of the most significant political morning in living memory, and they were in Yorkshire looking at a neglected country house because Harry had sat with the 13 properties list over lunch and decided that understanding what he actually had was more useful than theorizing about it. He'd visited the Potter estate first, or rather, the site of it, because Godric's Hollow had the cottage, yes, and he'd seen the cottage, but the Potter family seat was a different property entirely, a manor in the Cotswolds called Linnet House that he'd had absolutely no knowledge of until Longsword placed the deed on the table this morning. It was in better condition than Whitmore Hall, someone had been maintaining it, and when Harry had touched the front door and the wards had let him through immediately, he'd felt the house sort of settle, like a dog that had been waiting by the door and finally heard the right footstep. He hadn't gone in. Not yet. That felt like something that deserved more than 15 minutes of a frantic day. He'd logged it, noted the wards were intact and the structure sound, and moved on. Whitmore Hall was different. Whitmore Hall was Neville's. The front door opened to the same immediate recognition, the Hufflepuff ring and the old magic agreeing on Harry's authority, the lock releasing, and they went in together. The interior was dim and smelled of old wood and the particular sweetness of dried herbs, because the late Augusta Longbottom was apparently not above a bit of practical magic housekeeping even in a house she visited twice a year. The furniture was covered with Holland cloths. The fireplaces were swept clean. The floors were dusty but the beams were sound. Neville walked through the main hall slowly, pulling dust sheets off things as he went, a writing desk, 2 armchairs, a sideboard with a mirror above it whose reflection was slightly silver at the edges the way magical mirrors got when left alone, and his face was doing something complicated and quiet that Harry didn't comment on. I've never been here before, Neville said. Gran said it wasn't safe. During Voldemort's first rise, my parents stayed somewhere else. After, well. It's been 20 years. It's yours, Harry said. Clear as anything. Neville ran a hand along the writing desk surface, came away with a stripe of dust on his palm. "It'll take work." "Good," Harry said. "You like work." Neville looked at him sideways. "You're annoyingly positive about this." "I woke up on the floor of Gringotts this morning," Harry said. "Everything that's happened since has been upward. I'm running with it." Neville almost smiled, then actually did, and it was the kind of smile that had earned itself, not the polite, slightly anxious expression he'd worn for most of their first few years at Hogwarts, but the one that had started appearing in 5th year and become permanent somewhere around the time he'd pulled a sword out of a hat. They spent 40 minutes at Whitmore Hall, long enough for Hermione to document the property's condition, long enough for the maintenance records in the estate manager's office to be retrieved, long enough for Harry to understand which of the protective enchantments had been cast by the Hufflepuff bloodline magic and which were more recent additions. The Hufflepuff magic was unmistakable now that he knew what to feel for, that deep-rooted warmth, patient and enduring, nothing flashy about it. It was the magic of a house that had been carefully loved. "The Longbottom filing against the Ministry Estate Office," Harry said as they walked back down the drive, "is going to cause a fight." "I know," Neville said. "The Ministry is going to claim it's complicated by Bode's death. They'll try to make it about procedure." Harry flexed his hands absently, a habit already forming around the rings, feeling the 13 points of presence and weight. "Longsword thinks it'll take 6 months to force a hearing." "6 months is fine," Neville said. "I waited 24 years. Harry nodded. "I want you to know, if it becomes relevant, my name and the house claims are available. All 13 of them. You don't have to fight that battle alone." Neville looked at him. There was something in his face that was very old-fashioned in the best possible way, the particular look of someone who has been offered a genuine oath and is taking it seriously. "You'd do that," he said. Not a question, not surprise exactly, but a recognition. "Obviously," Harry said. They were halfway to Hogsmeade via side-along when Harry's mirror went off. He checked it mid-apparition, which was probably inadvisable, and found that Hermione was already looking at hers with an expression that suggested something had happened that was either significant, annoying, or both. It turned out to be significantly annoying. Percy Weasley was waiting for them at the Gringotts entrance. He was in full ministry robes, which was a choice that communicated several things about where Percy's head was currently located, and he was flanked by 2 ministry officials who had the upright, anxious posture of people who have been told to look imposing but haven't had enough practice. Percy himself looked, Harry studied him in the moment before Percy saw them, like someone in the early stages of realizing that the position they'd taken was on the wrong side of something larger than they'd calculated for. He'd come back to the family. Harry knew that, he'd been told, during the battle, that Percy had reappeared, had fought alongside his brothers, had apparently said something to his father that had made Arthur Weasley cry. That was good. That was real. Harry didn't hold Percy's years of ministry loyalty against him, or not primarily, because Percy's sins were the sins of ambition and institutional faith and those were forgivable in a way that certain other things weren't. But Percy was here in ministry robes with 2 officials, and that was a different thing. "Harry," Percy said, and the careful professional tone collided visibly with the fact that he'd spent 3 days fighting a war alongside Harry and his family, and the collision was uncomfortable for Percy in a way that was entirely his own problem. "I've been asked to convey the ministry's position on the morning's events." "Morning's events," Harry repeated. "The arrest. The press statement." Percy produced a scroll from his robe with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent years producing scrolls at official moments. "The ministry wishes to make clear that the charges against Professor Dumbledore, are subject to review under the Wisengamot's criminal jurisdiction, and that Gringotts' unilateral action in pursuing the arrest without coordinating with the banking accords of 1478, Harry said, predate the Wisengamot by 2 centuries. Gringotts has independent prosecutorial authority over theft from its vaults. This isn't a question of coordination, Percy. It's a question of whether the ministry understands its own legal history, and based on this conversation, I'm skeptical." Percy blinked. The scroll hovered slightly in his hand, its purpose suddenly uncertain. The minister, Percy said, recovering, would like to schedule a meeting. Tell the minister I'm available Thursday morning, Harry said. At Linnet House. Not the ministry. My ground, not his, and he can bring whoever he needs to bring, but I'd recommend keeping it small because I will have Gringotts legal representation present and that tends to make ministry officials nervous. One of Percy's flanking officials shifted. Percy's jaw tightened slightly. Harry, I understand that there's been a lot of information to process, Percy. Harry's voice was still pleasant, still level, with no edge to it, which made the content of what he said land harder than an edge would have. I'm not processing. I'm very clear. Your minister wants to find a way to manage this situation the way the ministry manages everything, slowly, quietly, with enough procedure that nothing actually changes. I don't want that. Gringotts doesn't want that. And the 13 houses I now represent definitely don't want that. He held Percy's gaze. Tell him Thursday. Tell him the location. And tell him that if he'd like to have a productive conversation, he should come prepared to discuss actual reform of the Wisengamot's oversight role, because that's the only conversation I'm currently interested in having. Percy stood very still. I'll convey your response, he said, finally. Tell Molly I'll come for dinner this weekend, Harry said, because it was true and because Percy needed a reminder that none of this was personal. And tell her not to make a fuss, because she will make a fuss and I love her for it, but Sunday should be a normal dinner, not an event. Something moved in Percy's face, a crack in the professional composure, something that was probably gratitude and relief and younger brother all tangled together. He nodded, once, and rolled the scroll back up. I'll tell her, he said, and it came out in a register that had nothing to do with the ministry. Harry nodded and went inside. Hermione appeared at his shoulder. That was well done. Percy's not the enemy, Harry said quietly. He's just the ministry's current face. I'd rather he come to Thursday's meeting having thought about whose side he actually wants to be on. And if he comes as a ministry messenger instead of as himself? Then I'll work around him, Harry said, and the simplicity of it was not casual. It was the simplicity of someone who has decided they don't have enough energy left for obstacles, only for the work. The afternoon gave way to something Harry hadn't expected, the Black family seat. Grimmauld Place was always going to be on the properties list, and Harry had been bracing for it all day, the way you brace for a dentist appointment you've been putting off. The house had been order headquarters, which meant it had been functional and lived in and also deeply unpleasant in the specific way of houses whose emotional history saturated every wall. He went alone. He told Hermione and Ron he'd be an hour, tops, and apparat to the familiar street with its careful muggle-repellent charms and stood outside number 12 and looked at it. It looked better than it had. Not dramatically, it was still a tall, narrow, slightly forbidding London townhouse with a front door that opened like a mouth, but someone had cleared the weeds from the steps, and the windows were clean, and the general air of exhausted malevolence had diminished somewhat. Harry suspected Creature, who had apparently taken his new orders, treat the house with dignity, very seriously in the months since the battle. He went in. The hall was clean. Really clean, not the grudging minimum standard clean of before, but the clean of a house that was being cared for by someone who meant it. The portrait of Walburga Black was covered with a thick curtain that appeared to have been spelled permanently closed, and the general smell of old damp and dark magic had been replaced by something that was just a house. An old house with good bones and a complicated history. Creature appeared from the kitchen door almost immediately, moving with the particular alert quality that house elves got when they were doing work they considered important. Master Harry is here, Creature said, in his deep gravelly rasp. His enormous eyes assessed Harry with ancient careful intelligence. Creature has been maintaining the house. Creature has been keeping it ready. I can see that, Harry said, and he meant it sincerely. It looks good, Creature. You've done well. Creature stood a little straighter, a movement almost too small to catch, but Harry caught it. Master Harry is wearing the rings, Creature said. He looked at Harry's hands with an expression that no one but a house elf could fully read, something layered and ancient and bound by magic so old it had become biology. Creature sees the black ring. And the others. He was quiet for a moment. Master Sirius would have liked this. Harry felt the hit of it in his chest and let it pass through rather than stopping it. Yeah, he said. I think he would have. He walked through the house. It took time, not because it was large, it was tall rather than sprawling, 5 floors of Victorian magical architecture, but because he moved slowly and deliberately, letting himself feel the place rather than just observe it. The black ring responded to each room the way the Hufflepuff ring had responded to Whitmore Hall, a deep recognition, a sense of being claimed in return. The library was extraordinary. He'd known it was good, he'd seen it before, but knowing it and understanding it were different things now. The Black Family Library was one of the largest private magical libraries in Britain, and roughly a third of it was dark arts material that was now, technically, his to decide what to do with. He thought about that for a moment, the Riddle Diary, the Horcruxes, the years of hunting through dangerous and dark and terrible magic, and thought about what Hermione could do with access to a research library like this if the dark arts materials were properly catalogued and made available to appropriate scholars, and filed it as a future conversation. On the 5th floor, in a room he hadn't visited before, a study that had clearly been Sirius's grandfather's, all dark wood and serious furniture and a portrait of Arcturus Black that regarded Harry with barely concealed surprise, Harry found a locked cabinet. The lock recognized the black ring immediately and opened. Inside, papers, scrolls, sealed letters, and at the back, a small box. He recognized the box before he opened it because the crest on its lid matched the one in the Gringotts Heritage Vault, a different seal, this one the Black family's constellation crest, but the same dark wood, the same careful preservation. He opened it. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was Sirius's. Harry sat down on the floor of Arcturus Black's study, back against the cabinet, and read it. Harry, if you're reading this then something happened to me and you found the cabinet, which means you've been to Gringotts and done something official which means you're finally figuring out what you've got. Took you long enough. I'm writing this in July, just after your 5th year ended. I want to tell you some things I should have said in person but kept not saying because there was always a reason to wait. The Black family made me angry my whole life. Not just them, but what they stood for, the closed system, the pure blood nonsense, the way they'd burn someone off the family tree for marrying the wrong person, and call that principle. I spent 20 years being angry at being a Black. But the Black name has weight, and that weight isn't only because of the bad things. The Black family built things. Libraries, wards, magical traditions, oaths. Some of it is genuinely extraordinary. I want you to have it, and I want you to do better with it than any Black before you, and I think you will, because you're the one person I know who manages to be powerful without being in love with the power. The cabinet has everything the family kept hidden. Some of it you'll find useful. Some of it is just history. There's an oath register in there, every magical oath sworn by Black family members for the past 4 centuries. It matters legally. Longsword at Gringotts will know what to do with it. Tell Remus I said hello. Tell him to stop being careful about everything. Tell him I was right about whatever he's currently arguing with himself about. You're going to be fine, Harry. You always were. I just needed you to figure that out for yourself. Sirius Harry sat with it for a while. The house was quiet around him, afternoon light coming through the study window, the portrait of Arcturus Black watching him with an expression that had moved from surprise to something more complicated and less hostile. Eventually, Harry folded the letter carefully and put it in his inside jacket pocket. He retrieved the oath register from the cabinet, a heavy book bound in dark leather, its spine cracked with age, and set it on the desk. Then he said, to the portrait, he would have been insufferable if he'd known I was going to end up with 13 houses. Arcturus Black's portrait looked at him for a long moment. He was insufferable regardless, the painted figure said. His voice was dry as dust and carried the accent of old wizarding aristocracy that Sirius had spent his whole life deliberately sanding off his own speech. He was the most insufferable child this family ever produced. Another pause. He was also the best of us. I told him that once. He didn't believe me. He wouldn't have, Harry said. No. Arcturus looked at the rings on Harry's hands with the attention of a man reading a very significant document. 13, he said. 13. Including Emery's. Including Emery's. A pause. My granddaughter Andromeda could have told them, Arcturus said. She traced the bloodlines herself, as a young woman. No one listened. She married a Muggle-born man and they considered everything she said afterward to be irrelevant. The painted voice was dry but the dryness covered something. The family's losses from its own foolishness are more significant than its losses from outside enemies. I have had considerable time to consider this. I know someone who'd like to meet you, Harry said, thinking of Hermione. She has questions about the early Black family history. She'll probably be here for 6 hours minimum. I have had considerable time to consider many things, Arcturus said, and the portrait settled back in its painted chair with the expression of a man who is finally, after a long wait, going to be useful. Send her whenever you like. Harry left Grimmauld Place just after 4 in the afternoon, with the oath register under his arm and Sirius's letter against his chest. He was in Diagon Alley, heading back toward Gringotts, when he heard the voice. Potter. The alley wasn't busy, it was the day after a war, and most of Wizarding Britain was still processing, but there were enough people that Harry had been navigating them half-automatically, thinking about the Thursday meeting and the oath register and the properties list. He stopped. Draco Malfoy was leaning against the wall between Twilfit and Tattings and a vacant shop, his arms folded, his face doing the studied casual expression that Harry had learned to read as an attempt at control. He was wearing plain dark clothes rather than Malfoy robes, which was either a choice or a lack of options, and he looked thinner. Not just from the war, but thinner in some internal way, like something that had been filling him up had been removed. Harry had seen Draco's face in the room of requirement, in the fire. He'd gone back for him. He'd pulled him out. Malfoy, Harry said. You're hard to catch, Draco said, with a ghost of the old contempt that was mostly habit at this point, or possibly a defense mechanism, or both. I've been trying to speak to you since this morning. I've had a full morning. I'm aware. The entire wizarding world is aware. Draco looked at the rings with an expression he was trying to make neutral and not quite managing. 13 houses. Gryffindor and Slytherin simultaneously. The Prophet's doing a special commemorative issue. Of course it is, Harry said. A beat. The studied casual expression cracked slightly, just for a moment, and what was underneath it was not what Harry expected. Not pride, not resentment, not the elaborate performance of not caring that Draco Malfoy had refined over 6 years. Just, a young man who had something difficult to say and was trying to find the right words for it. My family, Draco said, owes a life debt. Harry waited. Not the standard kind, Draco said, and Harry heard the care in the phrasing. This had been prepared, thought through, was being delivered as precisely as Draco could manage. A blood debt. Older. My mother lied to Voldemort about your death in the forest. You know that. But you came back for me, in the room of requirement, before that. He met Harry's eyes directly, which cost him something visible. 2 debts, 1 life, 1 blood. Under old magical law, those combined debts create an obligation. A formal one. I know what a blood debt is, Harry said. Then you know that under the laws of the houses, the actual old houses, the ones the Wizengamot doesn't really use anymore, the Malfoy family's debt traces to the House of Slytherin, which is yours. Draco's jaw tightened. I looked it up last night. I didn't sleep. I looked everything up. Harry thought about Draco Malfoy spending the night after the Battle of Hogwarts alone in the Malfoy library, tracing blood debt law, and the image was so specific and so entirely Malfoy that it was almost funny. Almost. "What do you want from me?" Harry asked, and his voice was direct and without malice, because this wasn't a battlefield anymore. Draco looked at him. The careful, prepared expression dropped entirely for a moment, and what replaced it was something that Harry had never seen on Draco Malfoy's face in 6 years of knowing him: plain, unguarded honesty. "I want to know if we can start over," Draco said. "Not the debt. Not the law. That's there, it exists, we can deal with it whatever way you decide. I mean," he stopped. "Started again. I was told at 11 years old that you were someone I should compete with. And I believed it, and I made choices based on it, and most of those choices were wrong." A pause. "The war showed me what the people I'd been trying to please actually were. What they were willing to do." His voice was steady, but the steadiness was effortful. "I am not my father. I spent a long time afraid that I was. I don't think I am." The silence between them had a different quality than it had ever had before. No contempt in it, on either side. No performance. Harry thought about Draco throwing him his wand when he'd needed it, in those final moments. He thought about the room of requirement. He thought about a 6-year-old rivalry that had been constructed by adults with agendas and handed to two 11-year-olds to carry. "The debt," Harry said, "is acknowledged. I'll have Longsword draft something formal, because that's what it requires and because it protects your family legally to have it properly documented, which I imagine matters given what's coming with the Death Eater trials." He paused. "As for the other thing." Draco waited, and the waiting was very still. "Come to Thursday's meeting at Linnet House," Harry said. "I'm meeting with the Ministry representative, and I'm going to need people in the room who understand how old wizarding families think and what they'll actually respond to. You have that background and I don't, entirely, and I'd rather work with someone who does than stumble through it." He held Draco's gaze. "That's a practical request, not charity, and it's not an easy ask. The Ministry rep is Percy Weasley, and there'll be Gringotts lawyers, and the whole thing is going to be uncomfortable for everyone." A pause. Something working in Draco's face. "Thursday," Draco said. "Thursday," Harry confirmed. Another pause, shorter. "What time?" 10 in the morning. "I'll send the address by owl tonight." Draco nodded, once, with the precise reserve of someone who is feeling something considerably larger than what their posture is expressing. He pushed off the wall and straightened his jacket. He looked, for a moment, at a loss for what to say next. Harry saved him the effort. "Tell your mother thank you," he said. "For the forest." Draco's expression did something complicated and final, and then he nodded again and walked away down the alley, and Harry watched him go and thought about all the stories that run underneath the obvious story, the ones that don't get told because nobody thinks to ask. He was almost back to Gringotts when the first one hit him. It came from the side, a killing curse, green and immediate, fired from a hooded figure in the mouth of a side alley between two closed shops. The figure had been waiting, concealed, patient, had chosen the moment when Harry was alone and thinking and not looking in the right direction. Harry was already moving when the curse fired, not because he'd seen it coming but because 6 years of Voldemort and a year of running had built something in his nervous system that wasn't quite instinct and wasn't quite magic and was somewhere between both, a deep animal awareness that registered threat at the level of skin and spine before the brain caught up. He rolled left, the curse screaming past his shoulder close enough to feel the cold of it, and came up with both wands drawn, main wand in his right hand and the elder wand in his left, which he'd never done before but which felt, in this moment, entirely natural. The hooded figure fired again, a blasting curse this time, which was interesting, a switch from unforgivables to something less legally unambiguous. Harry caught the blasting curse on a shield charm that he threw up one-handed, elder wand, the shield so oversized it cracked the stone of the alley wall when the blast hit it. He didn't cast with the main wand yet. He used it to trace the second figure he'd registered behind him, had felt more than seen, because wherever there was one there were two, always. That was basic operational sense, which meant the figure in the alley was the obvious threat and was not the primary threat. He pivoted and hit the second figure with a full force in Carceres before the figure finished raising their wand, the conjured ropes hitting them chest first and wrapping tight in half a second, sending them down hard. They hit the cobblestones face first and grunted, and the hood fell back. Yaxley Jr. One of Yaxley Sr.'s sons. There were 3 of them, all Death Eaters or Death Eater adjacent, all currently supposedly in ministry custody pending trial. This one had apparently not been in ministry custody, pending or otherwise. Harry turned back to the first figure and found them 3 feet closer than they'd been, wand up for a third attempt, and he could see their face now, a woman he didn't know, older, with the specific expression of someone who has decided that the world will be better without a particular person in it and has moved past the point where that decision feels large. He said, "Last chance." She fired the killing curse again. He stepped aside, the elder wand already moving, and cast not a shield but a reflection charm, the most technically demanding piece of defensive magic he'd had to teach himself during the Horcrux hunt, the kind that required both perfect timing and a very large amount of raw power. He had both. The green light bent, curved, and reversed, and the woman threw herself flat with approximately half a second to spare, which meant she was fast and had encountered reflection charms before. Not good enough. Harry was already there when she scrambled up, main wand at her throat before she'd finished rising, elder wand covering the mouth of the alley in case there was a third. "The rings," she said. Her voice was tight but not afraid, the voice of someone who has committed to their position. "You think you can just take the 13 houses and change everything? You don't know what you're destroying." "I know what I'm building," Harry said. "That's more important." She tried to hit him with a wandless jinx, quite good, actually, most people couldn't manage wandless offensive magic under pressure, and he blocked it with the main wand without moving the elder wand from its coverage position. "In Carceres," he said, and she went down the same way Yaxley had, less dramatic, the ropes settling around her with efficient certainty. He stood in the alley for a moment, both wands still drawn, listening to the city. No third attacker. He'd been thorough enough about the reading of the space, he was confident in that. He looked at the 2 bound figures, then looked at his hands, then looked at the scorch mark on the alley wall where the blasting curse had hit his shield. The first assassination attempt. It was the afternoon of the first day. He thought about Ron saying "You're the most powerful magical lord in Britain," and thought about how power of that kind worked as both a resource and a target, and thought that he'd better get used to people making that calculation. He conjured a Patronus, the stag erupted from his wand with its usual force, brighter than he'd ever seen it, which was probably the 13-house magic effect, and sent it to the Auror office with the address and a description of the attackers. Then he walked back to Gringotts, both wands sheathed, not because the danger was over but because walking through Diagon Alley holding 2 wands was a statement he wasn't interested in making. He arrived at Gringotts to find Hermione waiting at the door with the specific expression she got when she just learned something significant and was deciding how to deploy it. There were 3 Yaxley family members unaccounted for in the post-battle ministry sweep, she said, before he could speak. "I know," he said. "I have 2 of them." She stared at him. "You, what?" "They're in the alley between Madame Malkin's and the empty shop beside it," Harry said. "I sent a Patronus to the Aurors. They'll be picked up." He paused. "And Hermione, we need to talk to someone at the Auror office directly. Not just about today. About the gaps in the post-battle sweep. 3 unaccounted Yaxleys is the kind of oversight that should not have happened." Hermione looked at him for a moment. "You just survived an assassination attempt and you're talking about administrative oversight." "The assassination attempt was because of the administrative oversight," Harry said. "One is the symptom, the other is the cause. I'd rather fix the cause." She stared at him a moment longer, then made the small sound again, the one between approval and relief, and pulled the door open. Ron was inside at the table with Neville, both of them looking at the oath register Harry had retrieved from Grimmauld Place. They'd apparently found it interesting. Neville had a yellow legal quill out and was making notes. Harry sat down. "Neville," he said. "You said yes this morning, about the proxy seats. I want to formally ask, while everyone's here, because it matters that it's said clearly in front of people." Neville looked up. "Hufflepuff and Gryffindor," he said. "I meant it." "Hufflepuff and Gryffindor," Harry confirmed. "Hermione, Ravenclaw. Because there is no possible world in which anyone else is appropriate." Hermione opened her mouth, possibly to be modest, and Harry held up a hand. "I'm not asking," he said. "I'm telling you that the seat exists and you are the only person I would trust in it. You can be modest about it later." Hermione closed her mouth. "Ron," Harry said. "I want you in Peveril." Ron blinked. "Why Peveril?" "Because the Peveril line connects to the Deathly Hallows, which means the seat has historically been about balance and mortality and the consequences of power. And because you're the best chess player I know, and what I need in that seat is someone who thinks 12 moves ahead and doesn't flinch." Harry looked at him steadily. "Also because you've been sitting there looking like you want to be useful since about 9 this morning, and this is how." Ron was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to need someone in Slytherin." "Yes." "And Emery's." "Yes." "Who are you considering?" "I've got names," Harry said, and he did, names he'd been turning over since Longsword had given him the properties list, matching them to what he knew of people's capabilities and characters. "But not tonight. Tonight I want to sort out the oath register and figure out how many of those old oaths are still legally active, because Longsword thinks at least a dozen of them create binding obligations on current ministry officials who don't know they're bound." He picked up the register. "And I want someone to eat something proper, because I know for a fact that Hermione had half a sandwich for lunch and that's not, I had a full sandwich," Hermione said. "You had most of a sandwich," Neville said, without looking up from his notes. Ron produced a paper bag from under the table. "Took the liberty," he said. "Fortescue's reopened this morning. First batch since the war ended." He set it in the center of the table, pastries, warm, the smell of them immediately improving the atmosphere by several degrees. Harry looked at his friends around the table, Hermione already reaching for the register, Neville comparing his notes to the oath entries, Ron settling back with a pastry and the expression of someone who is exactly where they need to be. The rings were warm against his fingers. 13 points of presence and responsibility and history, each one a different temperature, a different voice, a different kind of weight. He picked up a pastry, opened the oath register, and got to work. Outside, Diagon Alley was beginning to stir back into life, cautious and tentative, the way things came back to life after something very large had tried to stop them. The evening light was gold on the cobblestones. The war was over. The reconstruction was just beginning, and it was going to be neither clean nor simple, and someone had already tried to kill him twice in one day, and Dumbledore was in Gringotts custody pending trial, and he had 13 houses and a Thursday meeting and a black family oath register and a letter from his dead godfather in his jacket pocket. He took a bite of the pastry and kept reading. Chapter 4, The Wizengamot Shakes. The Wizengamot chamber smelled like old stone and older arguments. Harry had been in it once before, his disciplinary hearing at 15, sitting alone in the center of that tiered amphitheater while 50 wizards in plum robes stared down at him like a problem that needed solving. He remembered the chair with chains that hadn't bound him. He remembered Dumbledore arriving just in time, precise and deliberate in his timing, knowing exactly the effect his entrance would have. He remembered being terrified and trying not to show it. He wasn't terrified now. He walked through the Ministry atrium on Thursday morning with Hermione on his left and Draco Malfoy on his right, which was a combination that had required exactly 0 adjustment time from either of them, possibly because they were both too professionally focused to waste energy on awkwardness. Ragnok's legal representative, a goblin named Sharpclaw who made Longsword seem warm by comparison, walked slightly ahead, and behind them came Ron and Neville, both in proper dress robes, both wearing the specific expression of people who have decided to be entirely serious about today. The atrium was not busy. It was 8 in the morning, and the ministry was still technically in its post-war reorganization period, which meant half the department heads were attending emergency briefings and the other half were trying to quietly determine whether any of their past actions required explanation. The few people who were present watched Harry's group cross the atrium with the mixture of awe and anxiety that Harry had been receiving since the morning of the arrest. He didn't perform indifference to it. He didn't perform anything. He just walked. The Thursday meeting with Percy and the ministry representative, who had turned out to be not a single representative but interim minister Kingsley Shacklebolt, which was a considerably more significant escalation than Percy had suggested, had gone longer and harder than expected. It had started at 10 in the morning at Linnet House, moved through lunch without pausing, and ended at nearly 7 in the evening with a set of agreed principles that Longsword had drafted into preliminary legal language while everyone ate cold sandwiches and argued about clause structure. Kingsley was not Fudge. Kingsley had fought in the war, had protected Muggles, had understood the stakes personally. He was also a minister trying to hold together a government that had been infiltrated and corrupted and was now trying to reorganize itself while simultaneously processing national trauma. Harry had respect for the difficulty of Kingsley's position. He'd said so, directly, at about 3 in the afternoon when the tension in the room had gotten sharp enough to cut. Then he'd said, also directly, which is exactly why you need someone outside the ministry structure pushing for the changes that the ministry's own institutional inertia will prevent it from making on its own. I'm not your enemy, Kingsley. I'm the pressure that lets you do the thing you already know needs doing. Kingsley had looked at him for a long moment. He had the kind of face that didn't give much away, dark, still, deep-eyed, and the expression he'd settled into was the one Harry had decided to call the minister who is genuinely thinking rather than performing thinking. The Wizengamot session, Kingsley had said, is scheduled for Tuesday. You're planning to take your seats. All of them, Harry said. Through proxies, for most. But yes. That will be, Kingsley chose his word carefully, disruptive. Good, Harry said. The Wizengamot needs disruption more than it needs stability right now. Stability is what kept bad laws on the books for 30 years. Draco, who had said relatively little for most of the meeting, had spoken up then, in the precise and slightly cold manner he used when he was being genuinely helpful but didn't want it to look accidental. The hereditary seats occupy the upper tier. If Potter takes all 13, the hereditary block shifts from 8 to 21 seats. The elected members in the lower tier can be outvoted on every significant measure. That's why I'm appointing proxies who'll actually represent the House's values rather than just my political preferences, Harry said. I'm not trying to create a bloc. I'm trying to make the chamber function the way it was designed to. Draco had looked at him sideways. That's a remarkably restrained position for someone holding 13 titles. I'm remarkably restrained, Harry said, until I'm not. Draco had almost smiled. Now it was Tuesday morning, and they were in the ministry, and the Wizengamot session began at 9, and Harry had 6 proxies to formally present and 13 seats to formally occupy, and he was entirely ready. The first person who tried to stop him was Fudge. Cornelius Fudge had been out of office for 2 years, removed in the slow embarrassing unwinding of his denial about Voldemort, but he retained emeritus status in the Wizengamot and apparently still attended sessions, possibly because the Wizengamot was the only venue remaining in which his presence wasn't an immediate political liability. He was waiting in the corridor outside the chamber doors with 2 other witches Harry didn't know, all 3 of them emanating the specific energy of a committee that has formed around a shared grievance. Lord Potter, Fudge said, and he said the title with the particular emphasis of someone who finds the concept disruptive and is expressing that through pronunciation. He was shorter than Harry remembered. I wonder if we might have a word before. No, Harry said, without slowing. Fudge blinked, did a small startled shuffle, and tried again. I understand you intend to introduce proxy appointments this morning, but there are procedural questions that really ought to be addressed through the proper channels before. The proper channel, Harry said, still walking, is the chamber floor. That's what it's for. He glanced at Fudge as he passed, just a glance, quick and level. You'll want to be seated before 9. I imagine there'll be a lot to take in. He pushed through the chamber doors without looking back. The Wisengamot chamber was laid out in a circle, the tiered seats rising on all sides, plum robes required for elected members and traditional family colors for the hereditary seats. Harry was wearing deep red, Potter colors, which he'd found in the Linnet House wardrobe room, preserved in a cedar chest, perfectly maintained, sized for his father and requiring only minor transfiguration adjustments. Hermione was in Ravenclaw blue beside him, which she'd spent 20 minutes arguing was premature since she hadn't formally accepted the proxy appointment, and he'd spent those 20 minutes waiting patiently for her to finish arguing and put the robes on. She'd put the robes on. Neville was in the warm yellow of Hufflepuff, which suited him in a way Harry thought Neville himself hadn't registered yet, and the deep red gold of Gryffindor, which he'd chosen to express with a pin rather than full robes because wearing 2 complete sets of hereditary colors simultaneously was technically possible but visually chaotic. Ron was in Peveril silver, which was new fabric because apparently the Peveril vault had been sealed since the 1400s and the preserved robes were emphatically too small. Draco was not in robes, he was not a proxy, was here as a legal observer, and wore plain dark clothes that managed to be quietly expensive in the Malfoy way that seemed to be genetic. The chamber filled around them as they took their seats. The elected members in the lower tier arrived in clusters, talking, several of them glancing at the upper hereditary section with the rapid assessment of people recalculating their expectations. The other hereditary seat holders were older, mostly, ancient family names, some of them familiar from the Prophet Society pages, some familiar from the war in less comfortable ways. Lady Greengrass, whose family held the ancient house of Greengrass and who was known to be neither Death Eater nor Order but something more carefully neutral, arrived and took her seat with the composure of someone who has been watching political situations develop her whole life and has learned to wait for the shape of them before responding. She looked at Harry and gave a single precise nod. He returned it. Lord Longbottom, Neville, which was still slightly surreal, was getting looks from several of the older hereditary members, some of them uncertain, a few of them assessing in a way that wasn't unfriendly. The session was called to order at 9 exactly. Chief Warlock Millicent Bagnold, recalled from retirement to manage the post-war reorganization, a small stern witch with the energy of someone who has been asked to clean up someone else's mess and is going to do it thoroughly, banged her gavel and called the formal roll. When she reached the Potter seat, Harry said, "Present." Standard. Clean. When she reached the Black seat, Harry said, "Present," holding by hereditary right. Still clean. When she reached Rosier, "Present," holding by conquest and forfeiture, the murmur started in the lower tier. By the time he reached Slytherin, the chamber had the specific quality of a room full of people who have decided that what's happening is real and are only now beginning to process what that means. The Slytherin seat was at the far end of the hereditary tier, set slightly apart, unoccupied for so long that a thin layer of dust had settled on it. Harry said, "Present," holding by bloodline, sat down, stood up, and returned to the Potter seat, all in the same smooth continuous movement that said clearly, "I'm not performing this, it's just true." When he reached Emery's, the chamber was entirely silent. "Present," Harry said, holding by direct bloodline descent. The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds and then broke into multiple simultaneous conversations, several of which were conducted in urgent whispers and at least 2 of which appeared to be arguments. Bagnold banged her gavel. "Order," she said, in a tone that suggested she was entirely willing to have a very long day if necessary. "We will proceed with the formal session. Lord Potter, I understand you have proxy appointments to present." 6, Harry said. He stood. In the lower tier, 60 pairs of eyes watched him. In the gallery above, public seating, which was full, because apparently word had gotten out about what was expected today and the queue for gallery seats had started before dawn, roughly 300 more. "I'm presenting them all now," for the record, and then I'd like to move immediately to the first item of business." He named them, one by one, in the clear unhurried tone of someone who has nothing to be uncertain about. Hermione Granger, for Ravenclaw and also for Gryffindor's secondary seat, in the latter role serving as a check on Neville's primary Gryffindor vote in cases of conflict of interest. Neville Longbottom for Hufflepuff and primary Gryffindor. Ron Weasley for Peveril. A witch named Andromeda Tonks for Black, Sirius's cousin, Teddy Lupin's grandmother, the only Black who had spent her whole life understanding what that name meant and refusing to let it define her, because that seat needed someone who was actually a Black, not just a Potter who'd inherited the name. For Slytherin, he named Blaise Zabini. The surprise on that one was genuine. He saw it ripple through the chamber, through the gallery, through Draco's face in the observer gallery where Draco had carefully smoothed his expression to nothing and then failed completely to maintain it at the sound of his former dormitory mate's name. "Zabini fought on the Order's side in the final battle," Harry said, into the ripple. "He did it quietly and without announcement and without anyone asking him to. The Slytherin seat needs someone who understands the difference between the house's history and its worst instincts. I believe Blaise Zabini does." He didn't explain further. The choice spoke for itself, and explaining it would undermine it. For Emery's, he kept the seat himself. Not because he wanted to sit in it constantly, he wouldn't, but because the Emery seat was the oldest and strangest claim and he wanted to understand it properly before he trusted someone else with it. Bagnold confirmed the appointments, one by one, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has decided that the fastest way through unprecedented circumstances is to process them with standard procedure and deal with the implications afterward. Then Harry said, "First item of business. The Blood Status Registration Act of 1993. In the lower tier, 3 members started talking simultaneously. Bagnold silenced them with her gavel. One at a time. Aldrich Knott, father of Theodore Knott, currently in holding pending Death Eater charges, which made his presence in the chamber notable, stood in his hereditary seat with the expression of a man defending a position he's occupied his whole life and cannot imagine abandoning. The act was passed with proper Wisengamot majority, he said. Its repeal would require a simple majority of the full chamber, Harry said, which is what I'm requesting. The act required all Muggle-born witches and wizards to register with the Ministry for purposes of verification. It was used by the Death Eater-controlled ministry to identify, persecute, and in several cases arrange the disappearance of Muggle-born individuals. He paused. The act is a tool of persecution dressed in bureaucratic language and I want it removed from the books today, not reviewed, not amended, removed. There are legitimate concerns about, not began. Name one, Harry said. The directness of it stopped not mid-breath. He opened his mouth, closed it, seemed to search for the argument he'd assumed he wouldn't need to articulate because it had always simply been assumed. The verification of magical ability is managed by Hogwarts Admissions, which has no blood status requirement and has functioned correctly for 1,000 years, Hermione said from the Ravenclaw seat, without raising her voice. The Blood Status Registration Act has no function that isn't already served by existing legislation, except the function of identifying Muggle-born individuals as a category for targeted treatment. Its only unique purpose is discriminatory. There is no version of this argument that doesn't come back to that. Not looked at her. Something passed through his expression that was very old and very tired and also, Harry thought, slightly aware of its own obsolescence. The Blood Status Registration Act, Bagnold said, after a moment of watching the chamber, is called to a vote. Those in favor of repeal? Harry raised his hand. Around him, Hermione, Neville, Ron, Andromeda Tonks's owl proxy, she wasn't present but had sent a formal vote, the Zabini proxy, all the Potter-held proxies. In the lower tier, roughly half the elected members' hands went up immediately, and then, after a noticeable pause in which several people appeared to weigh something and make a decision, roughly a dozen more. It passed by 19 seats. Not sat down. Harry didn't look triumphant about it. He filed it away, one down, a very large number remaining, and went on. Second item, the creature status reclassification, specifically the sections pertaining to werewolves. This one was harder. The werewolf provisions had a different kind of political backing, not the naked blood purity ideology of the Registration Act, but a genuine if badly reasoned public safety argument that had accumulated years of institutional momentum. Harry was patient with it, let the arguments play out, answered the ones he had answers to and acknowledged the ones he didn't while pointing at the specific provisions he wanted changed rather than demanding wholesale repeal. It took 40 minutes and 2 amendments before it passed, narrower than the first vote, and when it was done Harry made a private note to contact Andromeda Tonks about whether she'd be willing to help draft the supporting guidance documents, because Andromeda had spent 30 years married to a Muggle-born man and raised a daughter married to a werewolf son, and she understood this territory from the inside. He let the chamber breathe for a few minutes, actual conversation, members talking to each other, some of it visibly heated, and then brought the third item. The anti-goblin trade restrictions of 1947, Harry said. Sharpclaw, in the observer gallery, made no visible expression. Harry had promised Ragnok this one, and he was delivering it. The 1947 restrictions were drafted, Hermione said from the Ravenclaw seat. Harry had passed this one to her because she'd spent 2 evenings this week doing nothing but reading banking law and was frankly better prepared on it than anyone in the chamber, in response to a goblin labor dispute that the ministry resolved by legislating goblin commercial activity rather than addressing the underlying grievance. The restrictions have been used to prevent Gringotts from offering services standard to any Muggle financial institution, investment management, insurance products, mortgage lending, while simultaneously requiring Gringotts to maintain ministry oversight of all vault access above a certain gold value. The oversight provisions, said a ministry member named Hop Kirk who had clearly been briefed for this, protect against money laundering and apply only to Gringotts and not to any wizard-owned financial institution, Hermione said, still pleasantly. If the concern is money laundering, the restriction should apply to all financial institutions equally. The selective application reveals that the concern is not money laundering. The concern is control. She paused. Gringotts has operated for 9 centuries. Their record on financial security significantly exceeds the ministry's. The restrictions do not protect anyone, they disadvantage one group of people based on species. The vote on this one was closer than the first 2. The 1947 restrictions had defenders who were not ideologically committed to them but were financially entangled with the status quo they created, wizard-owned financial services that benefited from Gringotts' limitations. Harry watched the vote count and felt it settle at the wire, passed, by 4 seats, which was enough. In the observer gallery, Sharpclaw permitted himself the smallest imaginable nod. 3 laws. 1 morning session. The chamber was by this point operating at a noise level that suggested the collective brain of the Wizengamot was undergoing rapid and uncomfortable reorganization. Bagnold called the lunch recess with the expression of a woman who is glad to have a recess not because she needs rest but because several members clearly need the opportunity to reconsider their position without an audience. Harry stood in the corridor outside the chamber eating a roll he'd had the foresight to bring, because lunch recesses in the ministry took 45 minutes and he had no intention of spending 45 minutes on ministry cafeteria food when he could be reviewing the afternoon session agenda. Neville was beside him doing the same. Ron had gone to find a proper meal and Hermione was annotating her notes with 3 different quills operating simultaneously, which was terrifying and entirely normal. Draco appeared from the direction of the observer gallery exit with the expression of someone who is not going to say what they're thinking but can't entirely prevent their face from broadcasting it. "You're doing it wrong," Draco said. Harry looked at him. "Which part?" "The sequencing. You led with the Blood Status Act, which is emotionally significant but politically predictable. Anyone who opposes it looks like they're defending Voldemort's policies, so you were always going to get that through. But the Goblin restrictions were your hardest sell and you buried them third, by which point the chamber was tired and defensive and it nearly failed." He paused, examining his role situation with slightly too much attention. "You should have done the restrictions second, while the momentum from the first vote was still building and before the opposition had time to organize around the economic argument. Harry considered this. "You're right," he said. Draco blinked, clearly having expected pushback. "I'll adjust the afternoon sequence," Harry said. "What's your read on the inheritance documentation reform?" Draco settled into the analysis immediately, naturally, with the ease of someone stepping into a role that suited them precisely. He was quick and precise, and he knew how the hereditary families thought because he was one of them, knew which arguments would land and which would trigger defensiveness, knew the unspoken political alliances that didn't appear in any official record. Harry listened carefully and asked 3 questions and let him talk, and by the time they went back into the chamber he had a clearer map of the afternoon than he'd had at the start of the morning. He wondered, not for the first time, what Draco Malfoy would have been if his first 11 years had been different. Then he set it aside, because what Draco was now was what mattered. The afternoon session moved faster. He took Draco's sequencing advice, and the inheritance documentation reform passed on the second ballot after a significant amendment that Hermione had drafted in the corridor in 20 minutes, which was entirely characteristic. By 3 o'clock Harry had 5 reforms logged, 1 partial reform pending follow-up legislation, and the specific satisfaction of having done something real rather than symbolic. He was reviewing the remaining agenda when one of the ministry's administrative staff, a young witch, nervous, moving quickly, appeared at his elbow with a folded note. He took it, opened it. "Dumbledore is requesting to speak with you. Not through lawyers. Directly. He says there is something you need to know before the trial. He asked me to give you this." Below the typed note, in Dumbledore's distinctive handwriting, was a single line, "I was not the only one." Harry read it twice. He kept his face neutral, folded the note, and put it in his pocket. He finished the afternoon session with full attention, nothing showing, nothing leaking, and when it was over and the chamber was emptying, he told the others he'd meet them in an hour and followed the administrative witch back through the ministry corridors to the Gringotts secure holding facility. It was a small room, not a cell exactly but not comfortable either, spare and clean, with a table and 2 chairs and a window that looked into a stone wall. Dumbledore was sitting at the table in plain grey robes, without his usual magnificent colors, and he looked older than Harry had ever seen him look, which was saying something given that he was 115. The long white beard was less impressive without the deep jewel tones of his usual wardrobe. His eyes, though, the pale blue eyes, still very much present, still very much watching everything with that particular quality of attention that had always made Harry feel simultaneously seen and assessed. Harry sat down across from him. There was a silence in which neither of them said anything performative, which was, Harry thought, probably progress. 13 houses, Dumbledore said, eventually. I confess I knew about 9 of them. I did not know about Emery's. No one did, Harry said. That's the point. I imagine it is. Dumbledore looked at his hands, folded on the table. I am not going to apologize to you, Harry. Not because I don't owe you an apology, I owe you several, but because I don't think an apology is what this conversation needs to be. He looked up. I want to tell you something true. All right. The money I took, Dumbledore said, went to the Order. Operational costs, safe houses, bribery of ministry officials who needed bribing, support for families whose breadwinner had been killed or imprisoned. I took it without asking because I knew you would have given it freely if asked, and I told myself that made it acceptable. He paused. It did not make it acceptable. What it made it was easier. There is a difference. Harry said nothing, waiting. I also told myself, Dumbledore said, that I was protecting you from the weight of it. That a child growing up in a Muggle household didn't need to know about war funding and orphaned estate management. That I was simplifying his life. Another pause, longer. What I was actually doing was keeping control. I understood that about myself, eventually. I did not stop. Why not? Harry asked. Because I was afraid of what you'd choose, if you knew everything, Dumbledore said simply. I was afraid that a fully informed Harry Potter would make choices I hadn't predicted and couldn't control, and that those choices would get you killed, and that if you died the world would end badly. I made your choices for you because I thought my wisdom exceeded your right to choose. He held Harry's gaze. I was wrong. I knew I was wrong by the time you were 15. I continued anyway. The room was very quiet. Your note said you weren't the only one, Harry said. Dumbledore's expression shifted, the honest directness that had emerged in the past minutes becoming something more careful, not evasive but watchful. The Ministry's Financial Oversight Office, he said. The trustee system for orphaned estates and dormant houses. I am not the only person who has used access to vault administration to redirect funds. I am simply the most prominent. He leaned forward slightly. Broderick Bode was one. There are 3 others still living. I have their names and I will give them to you, because the Gringotts audit will find them eventually, and it is better for everyone that the process be directed rather than chaotic. Harry looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because, Dumbledore said, and something in his voice was very tired and very old and very honest, I spent a great deal of time this week sitting in this room thinking about what I actually believe. About justice. About whether I think the legal process being applied to me is legitimate. He paused. I do. I think it is. I think the banking accords are the correct framework. I think Gringotts' authority is genuine. I think the charges against me are accurate. Another pause. I find it much easier to believe in a fair process when I've had a hand in designing it. I find it instructive to believe in one that I haven't. Harry sat with this for a long moment, letting it settle honestly rather than immediately. The names, Harry said. Dumbledore gave them. Harry wrote them down in the small notebook he'd taken to carrying, in plain handwriting without magical notation, the way Hermione had taught him during the Horcrux hunt because unenchanted physical notes were the hardest to intercept. 4 names. He'd give them to Longsword tonight and Ragnok tomorrow. He stood to go. Harry, Dumbledore said. Harry paused. You are doing well, Dumbledore said, and the simple directness of it landed differently than any of the old headmaster's previous commendations, all of which had carried the weight of management. This was just an observation. Just a truth. Better than I expected. Better than I planned for, which is, a slight pause, appropriate. I had good teachers, Harry said. Some of them didn't mean to teach me what they did. Dumbledore almost smiled. That is very often the most useful teaching. Harry left. He was back in the Ministry atrium and halfway to the flue when the second attack happened, and this one was nothing like the 2 amateur-hour Yaxley family attempts in the alley. This one was professional. The atrium was full, end of Ministry business day, the usual crowd of witches and wizards flowing toward the flue fireplaces, and the curse came from above, from the level above the atrium floor, from someone positioned at the balcony rail with clear sight lines and a silencing charm on their wand so the cast was invisible. The spell hit the floor 3 feet ahead of Harry, not a miss, a warning, which told him immediately that this wasn't an assassination, it was a message or a capture attempt, which was worse in some ways because it meant patience and planning rather than heat-of-the-moment rage. The spell itself was a freezing charm, hugely overpowered, which cracked the Ministry atrium floor in a 6-inch deep crater and sent everyone nearby scrambling. Harry moved sideways, pulling the Elder Wand, and tracked the balcony. 2 figures. No, 3, the third one stepping out from behind a pillar. Positioned for triangulation, each one covering the other's angles. 3 people who knew what they were doing. The atrium crowd was panicking, people running for the flues, people diving under desks, someone screaming. The hit wizards stationed at the atrium entrance were already responding, but they were positioned on the wrong side of the room and moving through a crowd going the opposite direction. Harry assessed the triangle in approximately 1 second and chose his response in approximately another. He went up. A vertical levitation charm on himself, wandless, so his wand hand stayed free, that launched him 15 feet off the atrium floor before any of the 3 attackers had registered that he'd moved upward rather than sideways. From above them, the geometry of their triangle became meaningless. He fired 3 quick stunners on the descent, 1 at each attacker, perfectly spaced, dropping back to the ground between the first and third ones in a controlled fall that he caught with a cushioning charm at the last moment. 2 of them went down. The third had been faster, had thrown up a shield charm and was already moving, professional, running for the balcony exit rather than continuing the engagement. Harry hit them with a full body bind from below at 40 feet of range, which was not a comfortable distance for that spell, and they came down hard on the balcony floor. The whole thing took under 10 seconds. Harry stood in the atrium, the levitation charm releasing, his feet on the floor, Elder Wand in his right hand, Main Wand in his left, and looked up at the 3 incapacitated figures and thought, right. The hit wizards arrived. They looked at him, then at the 3 figures on the balcony, then at the cracked floor, then back at him. "Third attack in 4 days, Harry said. "I'd appreciate a guard rotation, but I understand if resources are stretched. In the meantime," he holstered both wands, "you might want to find out who those 3 are and who hired them. The wand work is too clean for amateurs and they knew the atrium layout, which means either current or former ministry access." The senior hit wizard, a weathered-looking man named Proudfoot who Harry recognized from order briefings, looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating a working assumption. "You're not rattled," Proudfoot said. "I am a bit," Harry said honestly. 3 attacks in 4 days is worth being rattled about. But being rattled doesn't help me figure out who's doing this, and figuring that out is the priority." He looked at the 3 figures being carefully brought down from the balcony by hit wizards. "Can you get me identification on all 3 tonight?" "I can," Proudfoot said. "Send it to Gringotts, attention longsword. She'll want to cross-reference against the vault audit." He paused. "And Proudfoot, the ministry floor access. I need to know who knew those 3 and how they got in." Proudfoot nodded, with the respect of someone who recognizes genuine operational thinking rather than celebrity confidence. "I'll have it by morning." Ron appeared from across the atrium, moving fast, expression tight. "I heard, there was a crash and, he scanned Harry rapidly, doing the inventory that had been automatic since the Horcrux hunt, checking for damage. "You're fine." "I'm fine," Harry said. "Third time," Ron said. "Third time," Harry agreed. "Which means there's an organized effort rather than individual actors. The Yaxley cousins were opportunistic, but these 3 were hired. Someone is paying for this. Any idea who?" Harry thought about it. About who had reason to want him incapacitated or dead or silenced before the trial, before Dumbledore's evidence about the 4 additional estate raiders became public, before the Wisengamot reforms took deeper root, before the 13 houses became an unmovable fact of wizarding political life. "Several ideas," he said. "Nothing I'd call evidence yet." He picked up the notebook from where it had fallen during the levitation charm, he dropped it but never lost it, which was something, and checked that the 4 names were still there. "Come on. Hermione and Neville are still in the chamber and they'll have heard the noise." They found Hermione and Neville in the corridor outside the Wisengamot chamber, both of them already pointing in the direction of the atrium with the specific energy of people who had been held back from running toward an explosion by the mutual recognition that running toward it was not their most useful contribution. "Are you?" Hermione started. "Fine," Harry said. 3 attackers, ministry atrium, professional. All 3 down, hit wizards have them." Hermione looked at the notebook in his hand. "Did you get the names from Dumbledore?" "Yes." He held it up. 4 names. Former ministry trustees, all of them. Longsword needs this tonight." Hermione took the notebook, read the 4 names, and her expression went through several changes. "One of these people," she said carefully, "currently sits on the Wisengamot Oversight Committee for Goblin Banking Regulation." "I noticed," Harry said. That's probably not a coincidence. That's almost certainly why someone hired professionals to attack you in the ministry atrium this afternoon, she said, and the precision in her voice was the precision of someone lining up chess pieces and seeing the endgame clearly. Yes, Harry said. The four of them stood in the ministry corridor, gold walls, fireplace light, the noise of the atrium's aftermath filtering through from the other end, and the shape of the thing was becoming clear. The attacks weren't about ideology, or not only ideology. Someone in the ministry's financial structure had been benefiting from the same system as Dumbledore and Bode and the others. Someone who knew that Dumbledore's testimony would eventually name them. Someone who had decided that removing Harry was cheaper than waiting for the Gringotts audit to find them. The trial, Hermione said. It's in 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which the Gringotts audit will be finding those 4 names, Neville said. He said it slowly, working through the implications the way he worked through herbology problems, methodically, from the roots upward. And whoever hired those 3 has to know that. They'll try again, Ron said. Definitely, Harry agreed, without particular drama. So let's work on making it difficult for them. He looked at his friends. Tonight I want to cross-reference those 4 names against the vote records from today's session. I want to know if any of them voted against the Goblin trade restrictions. I want to know if there's a financial interest that connects them to the restrictions staying in place. If there is, we have a motive, and a motive gets us to whoever's running the operation. Neville was already writing. Hermione was already thinking, her eyes moving in the pattern they moved in when she was sorting large quantities of information rapidly. Ron cracked his knuckles. Right, he said. Where are we doing this? Linnet House, Harry said. It's warded, it's secure, and Creature's been running Grimmauld Place so well I feel like we should give him the evening off. Creature is a house elf, Ron said. He doesn't, he sent me a letter, Harry said. An actual letter, with a seal, reporting on the progress of the Grimmauld Place restoration. In detail. With footnotes. A beat. To be fair, Neville said, that does sound like someone who deserves an evening off. They walked out of the ministry into the early evening, the sky that particular dark blue that came between sunset and full dark, the first stars beginning, London's magical and muggle faces layered on top of each other the way they always were here, taxis and broomsticks, office buildings and hidden alleys. Millions of people who had no idea that 5 floors beneath them a war had been fought and won and was now in the process of becoming something else. Harry felt the rings on his hands, all 13 of them, 12 visible, 1 known, and felt the day sitting in him, the chamber, the votes, the names, the atrium, the 3 attackers going down in 10 seconds, Dumbledore's face, honest and tired and right about some things, wrong about others, which was the most human thing about him. The world was complicated and difficult and someone was actively trying to kill him and the trial was in 3 weeks and there were 4 names in a notebook that were about to become the most important 4 names in Wizarding Britain. He was 17 years old and he was fine. He turned up his collar against the evening chill and operated to Linnet House with his friends. Chapter 5, Dumbledore's Truth. The trial was set for the 14th of June. Gringotts had pushed for an earlier date and the ministry had pushed for a later one and they'd landed in the middle, which Harry suspected was exactly what both sides had calculated for when they'd made their opening positions. Longsword had been characteristically unimpressed with the compromise but characteristically effective in using the extra preparation time, which was what mattered. The 3 attackers from the ministry atrium had been identified within 24 hours, as Proudfoot had promised. 2 were former ministry hit wizards, discharged in the post-war reorganization with the particular timing that suggested they'd been on the wrong side of something and avoided prosecution through insufficiency of direct evidence. The 3rd was a private contractor whose name appeared in the financial records of 2 of Dumbledore's 4 named trustees, which was not a coincidence and everyone knew it wasn't a coincidence and proving it was taking Longsword's legal team the better part of 2 weeks. The 4th name from Dumbledore's list, a ministry oversight official named Willoughby Carver, had resigned his post the morning after Harry's Wisengamot session, before the names became public, which told Harry clearly that someone had warned him. The leak was either in the Gringotts legal team, which Harry considered unlikely, or in the Ministry's holding facility, which he considered very likely. He'd flagged it to Kingsley and left it with him, because Kingsley needed something concrete to act on, and internal security breaches were exactly the kind of thing a new minister could build credibility by addressing quickly. In the 3 weeks before the trial, Harry did not slow down. He visited 4 more of the 13 properties, the Peveril ancestral home in Godric's Hollow, which turned out to be 3 doors down from the Potter cottage and which Harry had walked past a dozen times without knowing what it was, a discovery that sat in him with the quiet weight of things that were both strange and somehow inevitable. He visited the Slytherin family seat in Scotland, a severe stone manor on a cliff above the North Sea that was more impressive than comfortable and which he had no immediate plans for except ensuring the wards held. He visited the Emery's family land in Wales, where there was no house at all, just old trees and older stones and a quality of magic in the ground that made the 13th ring warm so steadily it was like wearing a coal. He did not visit Ravenclaw's claimed property, which was in France. France felt like something that deserved a different day. He slept, properly, 3 nights out of 7 and managed on the other 4. He ate meals that were sometimes real meals and sometimes whatever creature had left covered on the kitchen counter at Linnet House, where he was now effectively living, in the suite of rooms on the 2nd floor whose windows looked out over a proper English garden that someone had been maintaining for decades against the hope of exactly this. He wrote letters, to Andromeda Tonks, about the Black Seat and the werewolf legislation's follow-up guidance. To Augusta Longbottom, who had received his first letter with apparent suspicion and his second with what Neville reported was grudging respect and his third with what Neville reported was a rather good bottle of elderflower wine sent by Return Owl. To Blaise Zabini, who had accepted the Slytherin proxy with the brief and precise response of someone who had been expecting to be called on and had been ready. He wrote to Teddy Lupin's grandmother and told her that Remus Lupin's son was going to grow up in a world where werewolves were people. Not because the legislation made it so, but because they were going to make it so, and the legislation was just the first step, and it mattered that she knew he understood the difference. She wrote back and said she'd be at the trial. Hermione spent the 3 weeks building what she called, with characteristic precision, a legal architecture, a series of interlocking filings, motions, and precedent arguments that would ensure the trial had no easy exits, no procedural side doors through which Dumbledore could be quietly shuffled into a comfortable resolution. It was, she told Harry over dinner 10 days before the trial, not about being harsh. It was about being complete. The risk, she said, pushing food around her plate in the way that meant she was primarily eating with her brain, isn't that Dumbledore gets too light a sentence. It's that the trial becomes a referendum on his legacy rather than an examination of his actions, and those are 2 different things, and people will conflate them if we let them. Can we stop them conflating them? Harry asked. We can make it very difficult to do with intellectual honesty, Hermione said, which was as close to yes as the question merited. Ron was spending the 3 weeks doing something Harry hadn't fully anticipated, which was working. He'd taken the Peveril proxy with the initial combination of loyalty and slight bewilderment that characterized most of Ron's reactions to things Harry asked of him, but somewhere in the first week he'd started reading, actually reading, which for Ron meant a focused and slightly aggressive engagement with the material that was different from Hermione's scholarly approach but no less thorough. He'd appeared at the Linnet House dining table one morning with a volume of Wizengamot procedural history, a pot of coffee, and the expression of a chess player who has just understood the board's full geometry. 12 of the 47 currently sitting elected Wizengamot members, Ron said, without preamble, hold positions that were created or expanded under legislation passed by the pre-war ministry between 1990 and 1994. Half of those legislative expansions were pushed through using procedural maneuvers that weren't strictly compliant with the older Accord provisions, which are still technically valid because no one repealed them. He looked up. If Hermione's architecture forces a review of those expansions, 6 of those 12 seats could be challenged. Harry looked at him. How long have you been working on this? 4 days. Ron shrugged, slightly self-conscious about it. Chess is just logic with pieces. This is the same. It's not, Harry said. It's much harder. Yeah, well. Ron poured coffee. You gave me something real to do with it. That helps. Neville was quieter about his preparation, in the way he was quiet about most things he was genuinely serious about. He showed up where he was needed and said what needed saying and was, Harry thought, rapidly becoming the kind of person who didn't need to announce their competence because it was already visible to anyone paying attention. He'd had 2 conversations with his grandmother, long ones, Neville said, the kind they'd never had before, and he'd come back from both of them with the particular look of someone who has discovered that a person they love is considerably more complicated and interesting than they'd believed. Augusta Longbottom, it turned out, had known about Dumbledore's financial management for years and had said nothing because the alternative, openly challenging the most respected wizard in Britain during 2 separate periods of active dark wizard threat, had seemed worse than the loss. She was not, Neville reported, at peace with that choice. She had also, he added, provided him with a list of documentation she'd been keeping quietly for 15 years. Longsword had looked at the documentation list and used an expression Harry had never seen on her face before, which was something between professional delight and genuine admiration. She'd sent Augusta Longbottom a formal letter of thanks that same day. The 14th arrived the way important days always arrived, suddenly, after an enormous amount of preparation that had made it feel perpetually distant, and then it was simply there, a Thursday morning with actual weather, genuine English June rain coming down at a diagonal across Linnet House's garden and making the windows run silver. The trial was held not in the Wisengamot chamber but in the Grand Court, which was deeper in the ministry and older and designed for precisely this kind of proceeding, the high-ceiling stone room with its tiered witness galleries and formal prosecution and defense benches and the central chair, plain wood, no chains. Gringotts had been very specific about there being no chains, which Harry thought was both procedurally correct and symbolically significant in a way the ministry didn't seem to have fully processed. Harry arrived with Hermione, Ron, Neville, Draco, and Andromeda Tonks, who was a tall black family woman with silver-streaked dark hair and the manner of someone who had watched the world from a very particular angle for a long time and had a great deal of patience for very few things. She'd taken the Black Wisengamot seat formally the week before, had said approximately 15 words in her first session and each of them had been exactly right. The gallery was full. Harry had expected that, had expected the press, the public, the political observers, but the fullness of it still registered physically when he walked in. Every seat taken, people standing in the access corridor above the top tier, 2 profit photographers positioned on the press balcony. The room had the particular quality of collective breath-holding, a city present in one room for one thing. Dumbledore was already in the central chair. He was wearing grey again, plain, clean, no ornament. He looked the same as he had in the holding room, older and quieter and stripped of the magnificent costuming of his public life, but alert. His eyes tracked Harry's entrance across the room and something moved in them that Harry didn't try to decode immediately. Longsword entered from the prosecution side. The defense was being handled by a wizard named Edmund Grace who was, everyone agreed, the best criminal defense advocate in magical Britain and who had taken the case with the professional gravity of someone who knew they were going to lose and was committed to losing with integrity. He was a thin, precise man who reminded Harry faintly of a heron, and when he nodded to Longsword across the prosecution-defense divide, the nod had the quality of 2 people who respect each other and are about to argue very hard. Chief Warlock Bagnold called the court to order. The formal charges were read, all 89 theft counts, the fraud charges, the inheritance manipulation charges, and Dumbledore entered his plea. He was very clear about it, in the voice that had once commanded the Order of the Phoenix and the Hogwarts Great Hall and the attention of the entire wizarding world. Guilty, he said, to the financial charges. Not guilty to intent to harm. I ask that the distinction be examined. The distinction was the heart of it, and everyone in the room knew it. Longsword opened the prosecution's case with the financial evidence, the audit documents, the wand signature matching, the vault access records, the inheritance documentation. It was dense and comprehensive and entirely unambiguous, and it took 90 minutes, and by the end of it the factual record was as airtight as anything Harry had ever seen, because Ragnok had spent 9 centuries building the kind of institution that produced exactly this quality of evidence when it decided something mattered. Harry was in the gallery, not the witness stand, for most of the morning. He sat with his group and watched and let it happen, and kept his face neutral when the scale of the thefts was laid out. The total figure was larger than he'd known, larger than he'd calculated from the individual vault accesses, because Longsword had reconstructed the compound interest lost on funds removed from investment over decades, and the number had become genuinely significant. The lunch recess was brief and quiet. Harry ate without tasting much and said very little to anyone, which his friends understood and didn't press. The afternoon session opened with the defense. Edmund Grey stood and addressed the court in the measured, even tone of a man who has thought carefully about what he can and cannot claim. The financial charges, Grey said, are proven. The evidence is not in dispute. What is in dispute is what those actions mean, their context, their motivation, and what weight the court should give to 20 years of service in which Albus Dumbledore's actions, including these actions, were directed toward a single purpose: the survival of the wizarding world against an existential threat. He then built the argument carefully, and it was, Harry had to admit this to himself, sitting in the gallery, because dishonesty would have been easier and he didn't do easier, genuinely good. Grace described the decades of war, the destruction of families, the constant inadequacy of official resources, the way Dumbledore had built the Order of the Phoenix with almost no institutional support and had kept it operational through 2 separate conflicts. He described choices made in wartime conditions with wartime information and wartime urgency. He described a man who had genuinely believed that the ends he was pursuing were sufficient to justify the means he'd used, and who had been right about the ends. The gallery was not unmoved. Harry watched faces, the way people's expressions shifted as Grace built the picture, the recognition on faces that had lived through those years, the nodding from people who remembered what it had been to live under Voldemort's shadow and knew what it cost to resist it. Then Grace called Dumbledore to the witness stand. Dumbledore walked from the central chair to the stand without hurry, without performance, with the dignified simplicity of a man who has decided to be entirely present for something difficult. He sat. He looked out at the court. Grace asked him to describe his reasoning. Dumbledore did so. He spoke for 40 minutes, and it was extraordinary. Not because it was manipulative or clever or designed to move the audience, but because it was honest in a way that Harry had not fully expected, and that made everything simultaneously harder and clearer. He described the early Order years, when they were outnumbered and underfunded and losing. He described the deaths, personal, named, each one a weight he carried in his voice, and the calculation he'd made that resources obtained any way at all were worth fewer deaths, and that the theft was a lesser evil than the deaths that inadequate funding would have permitted. He described the Second War, beginning when Harry was 10 years old, when Voldemort was a whisper gaining strength again, and the same calculation reforming itself from the same material. He described Harry. "I made decisions about Harry Potter's life," Dumbledore said, and his voice was steady and his eyes were clear, "that I would not make again. I placed him with the Dursleys because the blood protection held, and I told myself that safety was sufficient, when I knew that safety without warmth was its own kind of damage. I managed his education and his information and his relationships because I was afraid of what he would be if he was not managed, and I was wrong. Not because he came to harm, he didn't, or not because of my management, but because a person is not a plan. He never was. I treated him as one." A pause. "The money I took from his vault, I took because I thought I knew better than he did what it should be used for. I thought my purpose was clear and high, and that made my methods acceptable." His voice didn't change, didn't soften, didn't harden. "I was not right about that." The room had the quality of very large collective stillness. "I want to say one more thing," Dumbledore said. "Not in my defense. Simply as a fact, which I think matters." He looked toward where Harry was sitting in the gallery, found him immediately, as he always had. "Harry Potter defeated Voldemort. Not because of my plans, not because of the path I set for him. He defeated him because he is, himself, the kind of person who does not abandon the people he loves even when the cost is his own life. I did not make him that. He was that. Everything I did could have broken it, and it didn't, because he is more than I ever had the generosity to believe he was. He looked away from Harry, back to the court. I find that both consoling and appropriately humbling. The silence after it was the silence of a room that has had something real happen in it. Then Longsword said, "If the defense is finished," and Grace nodded, and it was time for the prosecution's witness. Harry walked to the witness stand. He sat in the plain wooden chair, no chains. Gringotts had been specific, and looked out at the court, and the gallery, and Dumbledore now back in the central chair, and the press balcony where every quill was perfectly still, as though the scribes had decided, collectively, that they needed to hear this properly before they started writing. Longsword asked him to state his name and his relationship to the case. He stated his name. "My relationship to the case," he said, "is that I am the surviving heir to 13 houses, 11 of which were victims of unauthorized vault access over a period of 31 years. I am also the person about whom many of the decisions described by the defendant this afternoon were made." He paused. "I want to be clear about what I'm here to say, because I think there might be an expectation about what it sounds like." He let that sit for a moment. "Albus Dumbledore was the greatest magical mind of his generation," Harry said. "I believe that. His courage in fighting Voldemort was real, his sacrifices were real, and the people who are alive because of his choices are real. I am not here to tell you he was a villain. I don't think he was." The gallery had been waiting for something more charged and was recalibrating. "What I am here to tell you," Harry said, "is that none of those things change what he did. Good intentions don't make theft not theft. A compelling reason doesn't transform the theft of money from an orphan child's vault into something else. It remains theft. It remains a violation." He kept his voice even and straightforward, the same way he described a Quidditch match once to Lee Jordan during a lesson on observation, just what he saw, just what happened, clean of drama because the facts were dramatic enough without help. "I grew up not knowing I had money, or property, or family history, or that my parents' estate existed. I grew up in a household where I was not treated well, where I was made to feel like a burden and an outsider, and the specific cruelty of this case is that the resources that might have changed that might have opened other options, were being used by someone else who had decided those resources were better in his hands than mine." He looked at Dumbledore directly. Dumbledore looked back. "I was 11 years old when I first walked into Gringotts," Harry said. "I had never had money in my life. I remember thinking that vault was enormous. I remember thinking, this is what was left for me. This is what they left me." He paused. "It wasn't all of it. A significant portion of it had been removed before I was old enough to ask questions. I never would have known if the Hogwarts wards hadn't fallen in the right way at the right moment." Another pause, quieter. "I would like the court to keep in mind that if Voldemort had won, the audit would never have happened. The theft would never have been discovered. That is not a coincidence. When you take from someone who has no power to inquire, you rely on them never gaining that power. That is not a lesser evil. That is a calculation about someone's permanent powerlessness." The stillness in the room was absolute. "I want a fair verdict," Harry said. "Not a harsh one, not a merciful one, a fair one. I want the financial restitution to be complete and correctly calculated. I want the inheritance manipulation charges to be fully addressed, because those are the ones that affected not just me but 11 other families, some of them with no surviving members to speak for them at all." He glanced at Longsword, then back to the court. "And I want the outcome, whatever it is, to be one that the system can point to afterward and say, this is how we work. This is what justice looks like when we do it properly." He let the pause run for exactly the right length. "We haven't always done it properly. We should start." He stepped down from the witness stand. The prosecution's closing argument was delivered by Longsword with the compressed efficiency of someone who had already said everything necessary through evidence and needed only to connect the dots with clean language. The defense's closing argument was delivered by Grace with the dignified precision of someone honoring a commitment even without a path to victory. Then Bagnold called for deliberation. The deliberating body was a panel of 7, 3 Gringotts-appointed adjudicators, 2 independent magical legal scholars, and 2 Wisengamot members who had been selected by the process. Harry and Longsword had spent the better part of 2 weeks negotiating with the ministry. Not a pure Gringotts tribunal, not a pure ministry one. A hybrid, which was new, which was another precedent, which was the point. Harry sat in the gallery during deliberation and did not pace, which was what he wanted to do, and did not check the time, which was also what he wanted to do. Hermione sat beside him and said nothing for 20 minutes and then said, "Your testimony was right." "I meant every word of it," Harry said. "I know. That's why it was right." She paused. "The part about the vault, when you said you remembered thinking it was enormous, I don't know if the gallery caught it," Harry said. "The gallery caught it," Hermione said. "Everyone in this building caught it." Ron leaned forward from Harry's other side. The woman in row 4 of the gallery started crying. "Ron," Hermione said. "I'm just saying he did well." "I know you're just saying he did well." "I'm allowed to, I know you're allowed to, will you two please," Neville said quietly, from beside Hermione, "just let this be the moment it is instead of narrating it." Silence. Then Harry said, "Thank you, Neville," and Neville nodded, and the silence was comfortable and the gallery's noise ran on around them like a river around 4 stones. The deliberation took 3 hours and 12 minutes. When the panel returned, the room reassembled itself in approximately 90 seconds, people who had been standing in corridors coming back to their seats, the press balcony quills coming up, the general atmosphere of collective breath-holding returning in its original form. Bagnold called for the verdict. The lead Gringotts adjudicator, senior, ancient, with the particular weight of a goblin who has adjudicated significant cases before and is not moved by the social magnitude of this one, stood and read. Guilty on all 89 theft counts. Guilty on all 42 fraud counts. Guilty on 4 of the 6 inheritance manipulation counts, the other 2 dismissed on technical grounds relating to documentation dating that the defense had argued successfully. The sentencing, full financial restitution of all stolen funds plus compound interest as calculated by the Gringotts audit team, to be drawn from the Dumbledore personal estate. Suspension of all wizarding titles, positions, and honors, his chief warlock status, his Order of Merlin, his position on the International Confederation of Wizards, effective immediately. A period of formal supervised restriction, which in Goblin legal terms meant that his magical activities would be monitored by Gringotts for 7 years, which was shorter than it sounded because Dumbledore was 115 years old and the adjudicators had taken that into account. No imprisonment, on the grounds that the guilty plea, the cooperation with the investigation, and the lack of physical harm to any individual, the theft being financial rather than personal, did not meet the threshold for custodial sentencing under the banking accords. The gallery noise was extraordinary. Harry heard it from a distance, as though he were slightly underwater. He was looking at Dumbledore, who was receiving the verdict with the composure of a man who had expected every word of it and had made a kind of peace with it in the 3 weeks since his arrest. His expression was not relief, exactly, but the nearest thing to it that remained available, the expression of a man for whom the worst of the waiting is over. Edmund Grace was leaning close to his client, speaking quietly. Dumbledore nodded once. Longsword was already at the prosecution bench reviewing the restitution figures with her team, and Harry could see from 20 feet away that she found them satisfactory. Beside Harry, Andromeda Tonks let out a long, slow breath, not relief, not triumph, but the sound of something that had been held for a very long time being set down. She had been 9 years old when the first Black Vault theft had occurred. She had been cast out of her own family for marrying a Muggle-born man. The Black name had done nothing for her for 40 years except damage. The restitution to the Black estate would come to her, to Teddy. Harry had made sure of that in the inheritance transfer documentation. He'd been very quiet about making sure of it, because it wasn't something he wanted to announce. She caught his eye. Said nothing. The look on her face said it all. Harry nodded. He found Dumbledore in the corridor after the session, in the brief window before the Ministry escorts arrived to formalize the verdict's administrative consequences. Grace was speaking with Longsword about the restitution timeline. The corridor was full of movement, people streaming out, press trying to get past the Ministry security cordon, voices layered on voices, and Dumbledore stood in the middle of it with the stillness of someone who has simply stopped being in a hurry. Harry stopped beside him. "Fairly done," Dumbledore said. "You did it fairly," Harry said. "The cooperation. The names. I was responsible for the mess," Dumbledore said. Assisting with the cleanup seemed like the appropriate minimum. He looked at Harry with the direct, undramatic attention of someone who has nothing left to manage. "What will you do now?" "A great deal of things," Harry said. "Yes." A pause. "I have a question." "You don't have to answer it." Harry waited. "In the vault," Dumbledore said. "When you were 11. You said you thought it was enormous." "I did think it was enormous," Harry said. "Was it?" Harry looked at him for a moment, and there was almost a smile somewhere in the look, in the particular complicated way that things that were both painful and absurd could coexist. "By vault standards," he said, "it was fairly average. But I'd never had anything before, so." He paused. "Yes. To me it was enormous." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, and what was on his face was grief, genuine and unguarded and too late, which was the most honest thing Harry had ever seen on it. "I'm sorry," Dumbledore said. "I know the limitation of that. I'm saying it anyway." "I know," Harry said. He meant it. He also meant, it's not enough, but it's something, and the something isn't nothing, and I'm 17 years old and I have an entire life and I am not going to spend it in the past. He didn't say all of that. Some things communicated better as silence. He was halfway back to his friends when it happened. Not an attack this time, something quieter. A hand on his arm, light, almost apologetic, and he turned to find Molly Weasley, who had apparently been in the gallery and had come down during the exit crowd and had navigated through the corridor with the inexplicable efficiency that she applied to everything from cooking to chaos. She looked at him with the expression she'd always had for him, the one that was both maternal and fierce, that asked nothing and gave everything, and didn't say anything immediately because she was having trouble with her voice, which he could see from the way she'd pressed her lips together. "Ron told me," she said. "About what you said. About the Weasley family and the estate and," she stopped. Started again. "Arthur and I have been talking. If the audit shows that order funds came from your vault, Molly," Harry said gently. "We want to pay it back," she said firmly. "Whatever was owed. We want to, it's a matter of, Molly," Harry said again, and his voice was very gentle and very clear and entirely not negotiable. "What I told Ron is what I mean. I don't hold your family responsible for decisions Dumbledore made. I never will." He paused. "But if it would make you feel better to do something with it, if the audit shows a figure and you want to put that figure towards something, there's a fund Hermione is establishing for families of people killed in the war who have no surviving estate. No names attached. No record of where the donation came from." She looked at him. "You can write the check to the fund," Harry said, "and no one will know, and it will do good, and we will never discuss it again because we don't need to." A beat. Something moved in her face. She reached up and held his face in both hands for a moment, the gesture she'd made when he was 12 and overwhelmed on a platform and had never in his life been held by someone who simply wanted to hold him, and then she let go and straightened and said, "Sunday dinner." "Sunday dinner," he agreed. "Bring your friends," she said. "All of them. Even the Malfoy boy, if he's going to be around anyway, because Arthur will want to ask him about his grandfather's collection of Muggle artifacts, and I've heard Narcissa Malfoy keeps a very good garden, and I have questions about her approach to dirigible plums." Harry looked at her. "I'll pass that along," he said carefully. "You do that," she said, and walked away in the direction of her husband and children, and Harry stood in the ministry corridor in 13 rings and a red Potter robe and felt the day settle into him like water into soil, all of it, the verdict and the gallery and the corridor and Molly Weasley's hands on his face, and let himself feel exactly how much it mattered. Ron appeared at his elbow. "She got you," Ron said, studying his expression. "She always gets me," Harry said. "Yeah," Ron said. "She does that." They walked back together through the corridor toward the others. The press was being managed by the ministry security cordon with the organized chaos of an event everyone knew was coming but hadn't quite choreographed. The 4 named trustees were being quietly processed by a separate ministry legal team in a side office. 2 of them had attempted to leave the country the previous week and had been detained by Gringotts agents, which was a reminder to everyone that Gringotts had a longer arm than anyone gave them credit for. The trial was over. The verdict was real. The restitution would take 8 months to fully process, Longsword had estimated, because compound interest calculations at this scale were not simple even with Goblin accounting. Dumbledore was in the corridor behind Harry, doing the administrative business of becoming a man without titles, and Harry didn't look back. He found Hermione, Neville, Draco, and Andromeda in a cluster near the atrium entrance, each of them in various stages of processing the 3 hours they'd just been through. Draco was talking to Andromeda in a low voice. They discovered, at some point in the past 3 weeks, that they were cousins, once removed, through the Black family tree, and the discovery had produced a relationship that Harry found fascinating to watch, both of them cautious and curious and finding, slightly to their own surprise, that they liked each other. "The 4 trustees," Draco said when Harry arrived. "Carver resigned but the others are in custody. Longsword wants to move on those charges before the end of the month." "She'll move faster than that," Harry said. "She already has the evidence, she was just waiting for today to close before opening the next front." Neville was looking at the atrium ceiling, the golden Gringotts adjacent aesthetic of deep ministry architecture, with an expression that had become familiar in the past 3 weeks, the expression of a man who is reassessing something very large and doing it quietly. "What are you thinking?" Harry asked him. "I'm thinking about my parents," Neville said simply. "About Frank and Alice. About what it means that the people responsible for that are either dead or in Azkaban, and the system that made it possible, the system that let it happen and then failed to account for it properly, is the one we're rebuilding." He looked at Harry. "I want to be on the committee." Harry waited. "The Wisengamot Reform Committee," Neville said. "Hermione mentioned last week that it'll need to be constituted before the summer recess. I want to be on it. Not as a proxy, as myself. As the Lord of House Longbottom." He said the title with a directness that was new, or not new but newly worn comfortably, like a robe that had needed a few wearings to sit right. "I have things to say about how the criminal justice system handles cases involving healers and St. Mungos and the definition of irreversible damage, and I've been waiting a long time to say them in a room where it will matter." "Done," Harry said. "Just like that?" "I'm one of 13 votes," Harry said. "But yes. Just like that. Because it's right and you're right for it, and we've spent enough time in this building watching people be on committees they're wrong for." Hermione made a sound that was quiet and satisfied and slightly triumphant, the sound of someone who had suggested this to Harry privately 2 days ago and was now watching it happen naturally. Harry looked at her sideways. "You told me to let him bring it himself." "I did," she agreed. "And he did. You're very good at this." "I know," she said. "It's quite useful." "Are you two done?" Ron said. "Yes," Harry and Hermione said simultaneously. "Great," Ron said. "Because I've been standing here for 6 minutes and I haven't eaten since 9:30 this morning, and I'd like to point out that the world's political reconstruction will survive a dinner break." Andromeda turned from her conversation with Draco and looked at Ron with the expression of someone who has just decided they like this person very much. "The young man is correct," she said. "Dinner." "I know a place," Draco said. "In Diagon Alley. It opened last week. Apparently the chef is from private dining room?" Harry asked. Draco looked at him. "Obviously." "Good," Harry said. "Because we're going to spend most of dinner on the reform committee structure and I'd rather not do that surrounded by reporters." "I thought," Ron said carefully, "that you just said the reconstruction would survive a dinner break." "The reconstruction will survive," Harry said. "That doesn't mean I'm planning to stop moving." They went out through the ministry atrium into the city evening, the June air warm and carrying the smell of London summer, all rain-washed stone and the particular brightness of a sky that has spent all day clouded and has finally cleared. The press cordon was still managing the court's exit crowd, and several reporters clocked Harry and started moving, and he kept walking because there would be time for press tomorrow and next week and the week after. There was always going to be time for press, and right now he wanted exactly this. 7 people who'd been through something very large together, walking out into the city, going to dinner. The rings were warm on his hands. The Elder Wand and his own were in their holsters. The letter from Sirius was still in his inside pocket, worn at the folds now from being opened and folded again a dozen times in the past 3 weeks. He thought of Sirius. He thought of Remus. He thought of his parents, who had left him a vault that he'd thought was enormous. He thought of his mother, who had carried 4 ancient bloodlines through a world that called her mud blood, and he thought she'd have found that very funny, and he thought she'd have found this whole situation, the rings, the houses, the trial, the Wizengamot, all of it, both overwhelming and exactly right. He thought she'd have had strong opinions about the Wizengamot Reform Committee, and they probably would have agreed on most of them. He thought, "I'll figure out the rest as I go." That's always been the plan. It's always been enough. He walked into the evening with his people and didn't look back.